Welcome. Today I'm going to talk about the most important and asked questions in interviews and kind of how to respond them, as well as special situations like writing thank you notes and that sort of thing. So I'm going to go into the questions. These are typically the most important questions you'll be asked and the most common questions you'll be asked. And how you answer them will make a major impact on whether or not you end up getting hired or not. And I've been doing this for 25 plus years. I see people going to interviews all the time. They answer these questions inappropriately and don't get jobs. And right now, the market is so tight, there may be a firm may interview 9 candidates and make 1 offer. So when you go into interviews, your ability to answer these questions in an appropriate way is really going to make a difference for you. And these are the people that end up getting jobs. And what I'm going to tell you about today is even if you're less qualified for a job than another candidate and you don't think you're kind of measuring up, you're likely to have a much better chance than even less qualified candidates. As another rule, it's very important to understand that when you apply to a job, you're at like 100%. Like the firm has reviewed your resume, they like you, they brought you in, they obviously want to hire you because they wouldn't bring you in if they did. It takes attorney time to interview you. It's a lot of work to interview you, and in their mind, I mean, they would rather just interview 1 candidate and have everything go well. So how you answer these interview questions is really going to make a difference. This honestly may be the most important webinar you're ever at, because you're going to learn how to answer these questions. Now, what I'm scrolling through today is a book that I wrote about interviewing that I'm going to show to everyone on this call. I used to only sell this online. It was like $40. I'm going to send it to you for free. But in addition, I also made sure that I sent this to all of the BCG candidates that we worked with to review. And it's long. I mean, it's like 150 or 60 pages because interviewing with a law firm is incredibly important. The things that you do are incredibly important, like how you approach the interview, how you answer questions, and kind of get through that. So I'm going to answer the questions that I believe after 25 years are the most important, and ones where they are going to get you through interviews. Now, lawyers make mistakes all the time, less so now than they used to, but people may ask you questions about being married or even questions about politics. When they ask you questions about being married, it's actually, in my opinion, okay to answer that. The reason it's okay is law firms actually value stability. They want people that need to make money and settle down. So getting married is often a sign that you need to support someone, or you're settled down because your partner's also settled down. So I typically like to answer those questions and encourage people to do it. Another thing that you have to be very careful about, different attorneys are interested in politics, and some attorney might get into their office and they might start talking about a Democratic candidate, you're a Republican, or vice versa. It's always better to try not to answer those questions. You could say, I'm not really interested in politics, even if you are, to kind of get away from the perception that may be quite negative when you answer that, because it can disqualify you for a job. And these are all different types of traps that people fall into. And you just need to be very, aware that, that how you answer these questions is going to make a big difference. If you say that's inappropriate, the firm's probably not going to hire you. And you just need to be very focused, if you can, answering questions in a way that doesn't make you take sides on an issue. If you take sides on an issue, then you could be taking the wrong side. If you take the wrong side, people are not going to like that. I mean, I'm sure you understand just from the status of politics that people are very one-sided, and Democrats hate Republicans, or Republicans hate, and vice versa. So you just may need to be very careful about that, unless you're on the side of the person that you're talking to, their side. So they're looking for you to make mistakes. This is a potential mistake you can fall in. You just need to be very, very careful when law firms are steering conversations to answers that could not get you the job. And this is a big one. People have to be very, very careful about it. And sometimes people will read things in your resume you don't like, and you just need to kind of gloss over them and try to talk about other things. One of the things that can be difficult is lawyers by nature are adversarial. So when they're looking at your resume, they're always going to be zeroing in on the faults. That's what people do that are attorneys. They find weaknesses and, they kind of go for the jugular on them. And sometimes firms that do that are actually not going to be good places to work because they're going to, give you all sorts of reasons that there's something wrong with you. But when that happens, you need to be very, very careful. You don't allow people to fluster you. You try to give straight answers. You don't get upset. You just need to be very, very careful about what you did. So I'm going to tell you like a little bit of a story, and it's not necessarily, it's a long story, but when I was in college, I wrote a book about Detroit. And I was very, very interested in it. I spent years working on this report and traveling to Detroit, interviewing people, and really was, very, very interested in it. And when people would ask me about it, I would sit there and talk for, in some cases, you can't even believe it. I would talk to people for this about 30 to 45 minutes when I was interviewing with investment banks, advertising agencies, and others who brought it up. And I just went into all this, detail. And it was very, very boring for the attorneys to have to listen to this. I mean, it was something that I was interested in, and I was basically talking like a ski student about theory, and I was boring people to tears. It had absolutely nothing to do with what I was doing. And then one day I walked into an interview, and it was a very short interview, and it was with a very famous hedge fund manager, Victor Niederhofer. And, even at that point, he was probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And, I had no idea what he was doing seniors at the University of Chicago. And he just took a look at my resume, and he said, "This is just ridiculous, of all this stuff you have, about Detroit." But he was just a ticket to making fortunes. I mean, you had hundreds of applicants, for the job I was in. I was interviewing like 10, and then, he announced, before the interviews, that he was going to bring back one or two at most. And so he asked me about all this stuff in my resume that had nothing to do with, what he did or what anything. And he said, "You just need to get this stuff off your resume right away." And then he asked me like a very practical question about how many bricks were on a building across the street. He was very, very interested in that. And that was really the only question he had. He just told me my resume is crap and asked me that and said, "If you can look and understand that, then you could be very good at this job." And I did some quick math, and I told him my conclusions and the reasons that I reached the conclusions I did. And then he said, "Thanks, that's all." I received a call from his office the next day, and the way he'd approached the interview really left an impression on me. He said, "You have all this stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with my job. I'm going to ask you some questions. I asked you this question that really matters to me, and you answered it correctly." So when I went back to see him for an interview, to his office, the interviews lasted no more than 5 minutes. The person who interviewed me told me my resume looked too much like I wanted to go to law school, and then basically asked me to leave. And so what I learned in that interview with this Niederhofer is a couple things. Like, your resume needs to look like you want to work in the place you're trying to get a job at. So you never want to put things that have nothing to do with a job. Your resume needs to look like something that is 100% focused on what you do. So that means you have to have your practice area just basically all over your resume. Eliminate things that don't talk about your resume. Eliminate associations that don't have anything to do with your resume. Eliminate past experience. Just put that you were an associate or whatever, and that's it on your resume, because you need to look like you want the job. And in my case, I looked like I didn't want the job. He probably brought me in because I was enthusiastic and I answered that question. But no one in their right mind was going to hire someone that doesn't have a resume that matches what they do, or all these interests that match what they do. I mean, it literally disqualifies you from the job. And this is something that an incredible number of attorneys do. They put all these things on their resume that have absolutely nothing to do with the job. All these associations that have nothing to do with the job. They get proud of the fact that they were on some, protests that was anti-immigration or pro-immigration, and they just do all these things. They talk about all their academic qualifications that have nothing to do with what they want, what the law firm's hiring them for. I mean, a law firm, frankly, all they care about is your current experience in your practice area. They don't care about all these other things you do. Your resume has to look 100% like you're whatever the practice area they're interviewing for is. And if you put all this stuff and interests that have nothing to do with what you're interviewing for, it's obviously, not a good choice. It's a very dumb thing. So, your resume needs to be all focused on what you do. No one cares. No one cares, whatever, whatever things that don't relate to the practice area. It's just how it is. I mean, you would not hire someone for a job that had all these interests that have nothing to do whatsoever with your practice area. So it's just, very, very powerful being able to be direct in questions and also your resume. I have a kind of a short story, and it was my grandfather, and he was, he ended up, came from a small farm. His daughter paid to send him, his sister paid to send him to the University of Michigan. And he had this skill where he was able to explain like all these very complex ideas to people without an education. So he was essentially writing about foreign affairs in a way that people that went to, basically didn't have a lot of education could, succeed, understand, what was going on. And so after he went to World War II and from Paris, and he was covering the war from there. And then after that, he returned to Detroit, and he was just being very, very simple with his the way he was writing about complex ideas. I mean, he would read like, a huge article in The Economist or something, and then be able to break it down to, some very simple points and explain it to people. And he became very famous. He was very well known. I mean, these pictures on billboards, and his column ran on the first page of the paper, and honestly was one of the most famous people in Detroit. And all he did was take complex ideas and, explain them in a simple way. And he also was doing one thing. He was talking about foreign affairs, and that's it. So he had a skill. It was one thing. And he did that, and he had a career writing for this newspaper into his 80s. And then when he retired, he started holding weekly meetings where people would fill up, a 100-person library to listen to him. So, that's all the kind of what happens when you make things simple. People rely on you, people like you. If you're in a practice area where you're very focused on something, people will like you for that. They will, understand that, you have an investment in one thing and you're doing that. And your resume should reflect it, your publication should reflect it, your interest should reflect it. Like everything needs to be about that, not something else, So, if you have entertainment society on your resume, or you have, different things talking about different activities you did that have nothing to do with what they want to do, then they're just not going to be interested in you. And frankly, it's very interesting when you see the best resumes from people that, went to top law schools. They may literally say, I went to Harvard, I was magna cum laude, then I, was Phi Beta Kappa in college, and they don't say all the associations they were with or their activities. And then they say they were, an associate with a big firm for 5 years in the corporate department. And that's all they say. They don't have to say more. It's just very direct and people can understand it. And when people look at the resume, they just see a focus on one thing, and that helps them. And so this is not a resume workshop here, but it's a question workshop. Like everything needs to be about what you do and what your practice area is, because law firms, most of them, do not hire generalists. They hire people that are focused on one thing. And that focus on one thing makes you a much, much stronger candidate, because they can show your clients that you're committed to it. They don't have a lot of noise in the background like my resume did when I had all this stuff about research I did and stuff. Nothing to do with getting a job in a investment bank or whatever. So your resume, whatever you're doing on your resume, needs to be very, very clear about what you do. I had a woman that I spoke to this morning, and she had a very good resume for talking about all the experience she had doing healthcare law at a law firm. And it was very, very good. And then at the end of the resume, she listed all these pro bono activities that she did that she was very proud of while she was at the firm. Something like that, it complicates your resume, because even though you may be proud of your pro bono work, that just shows that you're also interested in doing something else. And if you're interested in doing something else, then you're probably going to go there. The idea of the person having entertainment law society and all these different things on their resume, maybe they worked at an entertainment company after college or during law school, any law firm that's interviewing that person for a corporate position would not hire them, because that looks like they want to do something else. The healthcare woman that I told you about, her resume was also littered with all these social justice things that she did when she was in college and law school, and all these societies related to different things about, different groups that could have been polarizing. And you just need to, be very, very clear about, what you are and who you are. There's a famous copywriter, he's died now, but his name was Joe Sugarman. And he used to run magazine ads, mainly in popular science, selling things. And he learned he sold, hundreds of millions of dollars of different things and retired, extremely wealthy, like to the tune of 500 million plus dollars. He was someone with no education that learned about copywriting and what makes people buy. And it's kind of interesting. He had this experience where he took out these ads and Popular Science and other magazines trying to sell watches, and he had like 3 or 4 different colors of the watches, and that ad did not perform well. But then he decided to do what's called an A/B test, where he ran only one watch against people that had multiple decisions and multiple watches, so where people were looking at multiple watches, and the ad where he only talked about one watch performed like many times better, because people only had one decision to make. And the idea of making one decision about you because you're focused only on your practice area is huge, because if you have all these other things in your resume, then law firms just have no idea what you are, what your commitment is. You just need to get them off, and you need to look like one thing. And the idea with a resume is it should be focused, your practice area. If there's things you did that aren't about your practice area, you don't talk about them, you just list you worked at the firm. Law firms need to get a sense that you're that type of attorney that they're hiring. Every job posting requires a certain type of person. They don't require you to have done all this research in college or in graduate school. They don't care about it. It's not related to the job. They only care about your suitability, for your job. And it's like that with, businesses, other businesses. They, what Honda did for a long time, when they came to the US market, they only focused on the Civic and Accord. They didn't make any other cars. There was no other choice. It was a good car. They didn't want to confuse people with SUVs and other things that they did later, which actually hurt them. But when they were focused on doing just a few things, there wasn't a lot of choice, and they started doing multiple things, and the business granted it was very difficult. So they had 2 things, but they made those things very, very well, and they delivered a really good customer service experience. But when they did different things, it hurt them. So I just want to urge you that you don't want to get other things on your resume that don't have anything to do with the job. If you do that, your resume is not going to look anywhere near as good as it could with only one thing on the job. And frankly, when I review resumes at BCG every day. So today I interviewed maybe 300 people that had submitted their resume. And I noticed that out of those 300 people, only like 4 or 5 had focused resumes. It doesn't matter what your practice area is. If you have a focused resume, people are going to want to hire you, because that's it. They know what you do, and they know, what you want to do. And when you do that, any questions about your experience or whatever you've done are very well directed in that way. And it goes a long way. Lawyers will put things on their resume like, different practice areas that they worked on when they were at a firm, thinking that that experience will make them more marketable. But the vast majority of firms, almost all of them that hire lateral attorneys, are only hiring people from one practice area. So you want questions to be about that. You want to be asked questions about your practice area. You don't want to be asked questions about things that have absolutely nothing to do with getting hired for a firm. I mean, again, you may be proud that you were a member of certain groups in law school. You may be proud that you had certain internships in law school related to things that have nothing to do with your practice area, but that just doesn't help you. It makes you look like someone wants to do something else. You have to look very, very focused. So when, you interview with a firm, I see it all the time. Candidates who are underqualified for firms, meaning that they don't have the qualifications, the typical attorney there. And I see attorneys every day that are underqualified for jobs. I had a candidate today that was another healthcare attorney, and he had been, it was crazy. He worked at a couple in-house jobs when he got out of law school, nothing that great. Somehow he got a job with a really good firm, a New York-based firm in Washington, D.C. I couldn't believe it, but they hired them. And then the healthcare practice area kind of disintegrated, and meaning that there was a partner there that had all the business that was leaving, and all the associates in that practice area ended up leaving. And he was kind of the last to go because there was no work. But, what was interesting, and then over the next 3 years, he'd had 3 different in-house jobs, each one, that's not good, but they were all related to one practice area. They were just giving him more and more expertise in that practice area, and the law firms liked it. And the interview we got today was actually, 5 or 6 months after he had, received after he had received the initial, submitted his firm to the resume. So how do you match up if you don't have the experience and you're coming from another environment? Well, the law firm would not be interviewing you if they didn't see something very strong in your background. In this case, the guy was doing one thing, and that's what's so important, just continually, job after job, doing healthcare law. And he got an interview with a firm as, a 12th year associate, which is almost unheard of, and they brought him in. So you shouldn't feel intimidated when a law firm brings you in and you don't have the qualifications. The most important thing that you need to do when you are going to a firm and you don't have the qualifications is making sure that your experience, matches, that you talk about your experience and how good your experience is. And if your resume is very focused, then you can get jobs with better firms. I mean, better firms love interviewing people from firms that aren't as good, because they're trying to move up. They're trying to, get into a job that's really a fit for them. And the law firms would look at your resume. If you that are coming from a less prestigious firm, the only thing that you can do to really get ahead is show your commitment to that practice area, and that you want to get better experience at a better firm, more sophisticated work, or if you're moving from in-house like he did, that you really want to get back into a law firm, and the reasons for that. So having arguments that make you look more focused, committed to your practice area than the other people are the reason that you're probably going to get interviews with more prestigious firms. And it happens all the time. Anyone that focuses on one thing, maybe they're a less prestigious firm, can always move up, but they have to focus on one thing. Your resume cannot be all over the place. And if it is, you're going to have a very hard time getting interviews and also getting jobs. Your resume needs to be 100% focused on your practice area. And then when you go into the interview, you need to be able to articulate that you have that experience that they're looking for, or that experience that particular firm could be interested. In this case, and it's something I highly recommend, I had made a recommendation for this candidate to apply to this firm, even though they didn't have an opening, but they were a firm that did nothing but healthcare law. And after 6 months or 5 months, whatever the number was, they decided they want to interview the candidate, and we're excited about him. And so, you need to make sure that you show commitment to your practice area if you're interviewed with an underqualified firm. And the final point I just want to make, if you get interviews with better firms, that's a real selling point right there, because you can tell them, I want to be at this type of firm. I want to be at a firm that's more focused on my practice area. I really would like it. This is a really good opportunity for me. And you actually look better than candidates that may be coming from similar, better firms, because the candidate coming from a better firm may be, moving down, and that's not necessarily increasing, they might not be interested in the firm. The candidate come from a similar firm, it may be the same thing. So, or they may be losing a job. So being interested and showing your resume is focused on one practice area is very, very important. Now, another question I get often, and I probably get it like once a week from our candidates about, what do you do with thank you letters? And in my opinion, most attorneys do not write good thank you letters. Often there's typos in them. It shows the quality of your writing that may not be perfect. And, these thank you letters can often backfire on people. And more often than not, they do. When people write thank you letters, even, if they're very gracious and well written, then they can backfire. And they often make you seem kind of desperate, like you have no other options. Law firms want to feel, when they're going after you, that it's a chase. They don't want to feel like it's the only potential job that you have. They want to feel like they're getting something that's very hard to find. And if you start writing thank you letters, it makes you seem like, you're a little bit more desperate to get a job. And in that case, it can hurt you, So, sometimes, I'll talk about the situations where a thank you note is good, but there's always, a lot of, problems with thank you letters. And I just think, if you're not being guided by like me, like someone that's a recruiter and knows how to do these, it's kind of a little weird. I remember I went on a first date when I was in college. There was a girl I went to University of Chicago, and there was a girl that went to Northwestern, and we were starting up this very enthusiastic relationship where we met each other, again, like she went to my high school and like everything seemed to be developing very well. She had a boyfriend, but was telling me she was going to break up with him because, didn't like him, and that we were a really good fit. And so after the first date, or, seeing her, I wrote her a long thank you letter telling her how great I thought she was. And it completely backfired. It was like she thought it was weird. She didn't know why I was sending her that thank you note. It wasn't the kind of thing that she normally received. And it really almost tanked the relationship. I mean, it did actually tank the relationship and took the momentum out of it. So, when you're writing a thank you letter, you just need to understand, like, what would you think if, you got a thank you note from a man or a woman after an interview? I mean, it's the same thing. Yeah, the people want to feel like thrill of the chase. They want to feel like, getting your interest, or, getting you, getting you, chasing you in one way or another is going to help you. So, a little bit more about thank you letters. I want to spend a little bit of time on this because there's so many questions about it. There are positives. I mean, it shows you're interested in the job. It shows you're appreciative. It may stand out because people don't write thank you letters. And so, it could also restate your case of why you think you're a good fit for it, and why you really want to work there. But again, if you're sending this thank you letter, the firm's going to wonder if you have potentially have other options. So, a lot of times, you'll go on a really good interview and things will, work out, but then you send this thank you letter and your interest in the firm, and they don't have to chase you anymore. They don't have to feel like, you have something that they can get. Finding you is a really good fit. They don't have to make those conclusions anymore. You're kind of showing your cards too early, and really it's making, it can make things difficult. I had a candidate recently that was working in-house in San Francisco, and he'd never worked in a law firm, and this law firm in LA was chasing him and really interested in him, and I made the mistake of saying, like, this is such a great opportunity, like, people in, this in-house rarely get hired by law firms. And all of a sudden, and then he wrote thank you notes, and then all of a sudden the firm kind of went dark for a couple of weeks. And then they came back and they said, they're more comfortable hiring him as a contract attorney, for the first few months before they make him an associate. So in that particular instance, I think, it hurt. And so, there's, a lot of things, about thank you notes that can certainly help you stand out. But the moment you express too much interest in the firm via thank you note, it can often be taken the wrong way. They're thinking you're desperate. They're thinking you could make mistakes in the things you say. Like, you don't know, like, I'm trained to tell people what to say, but you don't know all the red flags that could happen. Like, so sometimes people may say, this is a great opportunity for me to get trial experience at a firm that won't give them trial experience. Or they'll say, I really want to run corporate transactions, but a firm let them do that. So, just these thank you letters are just all these kind of landmines in the way you answer them. And they're landmines, but what I'm talking about today is landmines to avoid. Like, how do you how do you do things in your, you're looking for a position that are going to make you stand out as opposed to be taken the wrong way. So I really, for the most part, I'm going to tell you some examples of when I recommend thank you letters, but in the most times I don't. I mean, they can be very dangerous. So here's the process typically that a law firm follows when they get your resume and cover letter. The recruiting coordinator in a firm is typically given the role of, reviewing their resumes, getting rid of the ones that she knows aren't a fit or he knows aren't a fit, and then trying to circulate the best resumes to partners in the firm that maybe make that practice area, that may make, a decision about you. So your resume, comes up on their computer, they print it, partner will review it, typically for 1 to 5 seconds. All they're looking for, just so you understand, they're not looking for your social justice activities, your hobbies, your dreams, doing pro bono, they're only looking for someone that looks focused on a practice area. And if they see that, then they're going to be interested. Now, they'll not be interested if you have too many moves. They'll not be interested if you have long gaps in unemployment. But in most cases, if you look like someone that's committed to practice area, which again, this is all you need to do to get jobs. I'm amazed. Almost every resume that I look at talks about all these things that have nothing to do with getting a job, working in the firm. If you want to identify with certain political movements, if you want to identify with certain religious stuff or whatever, that's That has nothing to do with getting a resume, or getting a job. It can only polarize you. If you want to put things on your resume that have nothing to do with your practice area, the partner's not going to like that. So they look at your resume and they say, this looks like a corporate M&A attorney. This looks like a commercial litigator. This looks like a healthcare transactions attorney. That's all they care about. They're only looking at your resume for that. They have a need to fill someone, with a job in a practice area, and that's really all they care about. So we show up for the interview, and the partner takes a look at you, and they, based on what you look in your resume, and most people, you included, make decisions about people very, very quickly. There's a rule that not only do people make decisions about people in just a few seconds, I mean, maybe 30 seconds, but by the way you look and the way you can comport yourself, when you get in there, the partner's going to make a decision about whether or not they like you. That's just how it works. They're gonna, and typically you included, people like, 1/3 of the people they see immediately. The other third, they're not sure, they don't care either way. And the other third, they just don't like. So you are gonna walk into interviews with people that don't like you, and there's nothing you can control. It's just how people are. People see people, they make decisions about them. And it's unfortunate, but that's how it works. So let's talk about, what you can do to change their minds if you answer their questions well. If you appear like someone who really wants to work at the firm, if you are nice to the person and make them like you, then they may change their mind. And so that's your job in the interview, is to really change their mind that you would be the best candidate for the job. You do that by talking about your experience and how it fits. You do that by making the law firm think that they hire you can stay around a long time. You do that by trying to connect with them, even if it looks like you can't initially. You do all these things to try to sway them in your direction. So you have a 60% chance. If you the 30% that like you immediately, they may, be interested, and they will be, you can probably do very well in the interview. The 30% that doesn't know, or 33%, you can try to persuade, which you have to do. And then that 30% that doesn't like you, it's going to be hard to switch them to your team. You just don't know. I mean, firms are cultures. They have individual people in them. They're going to decide whether or not they like you there. And then that just kind of goes. And then what happens is the partner that interviewed, also associates the interview, do the same thing. They will be sent an evaluation form, and they will look at that evaluation form, check off some boxes, and it will take 1 to 5 minutes. The recruiting coordinator will then go over your reviews from the partners and the associates who interviewed you, and they will advise the hiring partner or different people that interviewed you what your scores were, if you seemed like someone that would be, good hire, that worked there a long time, or someone that seems committed, or someone that seems likable. There'll be all sorts of questions about that. And most people are ultimately hired or brought in for other interviews based on that questionnaire. So whatever that questionnaire says, they're going to write down their impressions and hopefully, give you a good review. I mean, there's things you can do, at the end of the interview to kind of make the law firm think that, you have more interest in them before they fill out the evaluation. You can say, this is the job I've wanted for a long time. I'm very, very interested in it. And, I really would appreciate, the opportunity to come back, something along those lines. Now, that it does express a little bit of desire to work there. If you connect with the person in the right way, you talk about your commitment to the practice area and how you can commit. This is ultimately how it works. After a second interview, there may be some discussion about you. Sometimes there's committees, and they will make a decision to hire you, based on that. They may also want to look at other candidates, and they'll fill out the same questionnaire, and then they'll take a look at who got the best, the best reviews. And then, you're ultimately hired or not hired, or the firm puts you on hold based on more discussion. And, sometimes, you may not hear from the firm, you may hear from the firm the next day that they want to hire you. Other times, it can take months, for you to get a response. People get interviews all the time, and then they get ghosted. The law firm won't give them an answer one way or another. And there's just all sorts of things going on behind the scenes. The law firm may be nervous, they don't have enough work. There may be internal divisions over an attorney from a certain practice area getting some of the hire, not another. They could, they could have other people that, that they're interviewing for the same job, hoping they find someone with better experience. And so, you're going to be often ghosted by these firms and not get any reply, and they may actually be making offers to other attorneys too before you. So they're waiting. They give them 2 weeks to decide. And so you're just kind of, you're in a position where you're not going to get an answer. And frankly, following up with the firm after that, it doesn't, always work for you. So, there's a couple of examples here about students that I saw when I was in law school that were getting interviews during their first year of after the, for their first year for getting a summer clerkship in their second year. And they were going into the firms that came to interview first years were typically like small regional firms. They were in, South Carolina and, different places. They weren't in like major cities. I mean, there were a few of them, but what these students did was just incredible. They went into these interviews, their resumes didn't have a lot of information on them, except for their grades and so forth. And I sat outside, arrived early, and I sat outside for, I don't know, like an hour and a half. And I watched people, I could hear people interviewing, and they were just all talking about how it was their dream to work in a small town. It was their dream to work at a small firm. And they had all these reasons that they were able to make. And so every time you get an interview, you need to really figure out, like, what is the firm thinking? The firm's thinking that if this person goes to we may lose them to a large law firm or whatever. So you have to be able to really commit, to whatever that firm needs to hear. So, a couple of things about, that I, think are, pretty important to talk about for this is that, people, rarely change their position. So it's just, judges rarely, typically, bend in one way or another, and then, with the judge. And so no matter what they write in their pleadings, they still don't get a job. I worked for a judge where in like 10 years on the bench, he'd never had a verdict against the defense. A criminal had never gotten off on anything, and judges can kind of sway things in one way or another. So people just don't change their opinion. And you really, need to be, aware of, what you can do. I had one experience with thank you letters where the attorney actually didn't get the job. So he had gone in for like a full day of interviews on a Friday, and in every interview that he went backfired. There was just like no interest in him, working for them. He didn't have a good personality. He had all these issues that, just practice area work wasn't focused enough, just all these things. And he was working in a small law firm in Tokyo where he had to take the train like 2 hours a day to work and to go back to live in a tiny apartment with his wife and child. And he really wanted to get back to California. I mean, it's a long story of how he got the job, but he really, really needed this job. And so I went and I worked with him. I had him come over to my house on 7 a.m. on Sunday morning. And, he was going to be, actually it was Saturday or Friday evening. And anyway, he was scheduled to go on a flight on Sunday morning. So he came over on Saturday, and we spent the whole day till like 3 a.m. writing these just incredible thank you letters that, talked about how grateful he'd be for the job, how much it meant to him, how he would commit, how, this was his dream job. And it was actually a good firm. And we sent those, via fax. We would say he was at a firm in Japan, so we made it. There was a Nikko hotel in downtown Los Angeles. We sent it from there, and it really just put a ton of work into these letters, and finally got them out at like 3 a.m. and it worked. I mean, he was all in. These letters that essentially I wrote, made him get a job. So sometimes, if you're at a where you're pretty far from the finish line, you're not going to get the job. This type of response where you totally connect to people can make a huge make a huge difference. But it's very rare. When people make when they write thank you letters, it often may make you appear like you don't have any other options. So you need to be very careful about that. People will think that when they receive your thank you letter. Most attorneys that write thank you letters have never written them themselves. And so I just feel, for the most part, unless you really feel the need. I mean, most of the time, you're going to screw up. I've seen so many, errors in thank you letters, typos, and different issues that I just really, do not recommend them for the most part, because it's going to give people an opportunity to think negatively about you in many cases if you make mistakes in your thank you letter. So there's just a lot of things. I recommend you review this carefully. A lot of times the thank you letters also will make you appear that you might be have other issues that referring to things that don't have anything to do with the job that you think are important. And so these are some of the more important things that I think about thank you letters. Now there is one case where I really like thank you letters. It's often the case of an attorney that's interviewing with a firm that for whatever reason is far, is not anywhere near the type of firm that you would expect them to work for. So like an AmLaw, for a top firm, interviewing a small firm, the small firm's going to feel like if they make this person an offer, they're probably going to reject him. So the small firm, doesn't want to look bad by making an offer and then having all their partners feel like it's a bad place to do work. So law firms really, they want to see that you have a real desire to work there. And so sometimes in that particular situation, you need to really, you can write thank you letters, and it can be effective because of what kind of assuage the concerns of people that you might not go to work there because they're not as good of a firm where you may have had experience at and so forth. Okay, so this is another question that people often have, and they go on interviews, and when they go on these interviews, they don't hear back. Like they think that people are going to respond to the thank you letters, people don't, and then people kind of assume the worst, and when they don't receive a response. And this is often the case for law firms contacting you for information, or as I mentioned earlier, you're not getting information from a law firm or a response after you submitted an application. So, typically, when you write a thank you letter and you don't get a response, there's just a lot of reasons for it. They don't reject you. It typically means that they just don't know what they're going to do. Like they don't know if they need to hire someone, but they're choosing between candidates and they interview on people. So you just want to, understand, the thank you letter really has a lot of potential dangers to it. And there's very limited situations where it can be sent. And, and I just recommend being very careful. What we do with candidates that interview with BCG is we will record a conversation with them using like Otter AI, and we'll ask them all these questions about the interview, like who did they talk to? What did that person say? What do they like about them? What did they take away from the firm that they really liked? And we'll interview them for like a half hour and get all those answers. And then, you can use technology for this. And then we would run it through ChatGPT or Google as their own service and, tell the law firm all the things that the candidate liked. And coming from a recruiter, that's actually much more persuasive than if it comes directly from the candidate, because the recruiter is acting as a middleman. The recruiter can say things about the candidate that are positive that might come across as bragging if the candidate sent it. So, that's one way to use recruiters is they can do that, help you get jobs you might not normally get by really kind of filtering the information and saying things that you may not want to say on your own. So the recruiter's job is kind of to promote you. So these are some of the, the easiest ways that people avoid, need to avoid, screwing up interviews. People ask about, questions about, what should I do and what is the, the worst way to screw up in an interview. And, here there's, a lot of ways to screw up. I had an instance once where I showed up to an interview 20 minutes late. And it was because I didn't understand how much traffic there was going to be on Monday morning in Los Angeles. And, and it just was, I'd driven to the firm the night before and it took me 30 minutes. And I think, even when I put a buffer of like, an hour in my commute, it still took me 2 hours to get there. So when I did that, I didn't get the interview. The people that were interviewing me, they didn't do like a full round, even though they were supposed to. They let me go early. And so, showing up is just, late. It's just, it's a huge mistake. I don't know why people do it. It happens all the time. But, it communicates, messages that you don't want to communicate. It means it acts like the firm doesn't respect you, don't respect the firm at the time. And, when you show up late, the law firm has to move people around and they just don't like it. It's almost as if you're going to show up, and you don't care. So the law firm wants to hire someone that cares and can at least get to the interview on time. The other thing to consider with all of your interviews and how you answer questions is really what it's like you're being interviewed by a potential client to do work for you. So all throughout your career, you're expected to be able to answer questions, be able to sell first law firm partners. So you sell law firm partners that you do good work, that you are punctual, that you do what they need, and you're kind of acting like a general, doing everything you should. And then eventually you start going out, hopefully on client pitches. And that's when you basically act like an associate would act towards a partner. You do the, you convince, them you have a lot of, that experience in your practice area, that you're willing to work hard, do a good job for them, that you're the best choice, and that you're very focused on what you do, and then you're able to connect with them. And so your ultimate job in all of these, in your career is to continually get work from people and present the best case to them. And that means, again, like the best case is someone that just does nothing but a practice area and is very focused on it and doesn't have all of these outside interests that could make it look like the person wants to do something else. I mean, you wouldn't go into, pitch a client like General Motors and start talking about your interest in social justice or your political party or all these other things. All a law firm bio says, this is basically what you should be doing with your resume. A law firm bio just talks about the fact that you're an expert in one practice area. That's what they say. And so that's what they sell clients on. Their associates are an expert in practice area. Their partners are an expert in practice area. So all this stuff is just incredibly important. But young people often want to list all this stuff on their resume that has nothing to do with them. When you're showing up late for a firm, it's the same thing you could do to a client. A client wouldn't like it either. They feel disrespected. Okay, so here are some other questions that law firms typically will ask. They will ask if you're interviewing, anywhere else. They'll ask, why did you leave your present job if you're not employed? Or, why are you leaving your current position? Why are you interviewing with us? And then why did you leave your last position? So these are really some of the most important points about interviewing with firms. You're always going to be asked why you're leaving your present position or why you left your last position. These are just the most common questions. They're answers that are, road mine or, minds. And every time you're presented with a mind, you need to have a good answer. If you don't give good answers to these questions, then you're not going to get the job. So these are extremely important. They're, in my opinion, the most important, because anytime a lateral attorney is looking for a new position, they're going to be, asked about these things. Now, there's a couple of general rules when you talk about leaving a past position. A lot of times people will say negative things about their employer and the reasons they had to leave. They may talk about toxic partners. They may talk about, a firm is disorganized. They may talk about not getting enough work in their practice area. They may talk about the fact that they left and all these other associates left too. And, you really don't ever want to get into, anything regarding those type of things. I mean, when you are talking about, why you're leaving, you want to talk about how, you want to get increased responsibility, or how you want to work in a firm where you can more focus on your practice area, and how, you want to find a place that may be a better match for your personality and skills. I mean, the best answer is always, going to a firm with more work in your practice area. That's the most important. And if people are leaving because of that, then, that's also a good idea. And then there's other reasons. A lot of times people will relocate. So today I spoke with a woman that was a healthcare attorney, and she'd been at a big firm, like a very good firm in Chicago, doing healthcare law. And she picked up and moved to Madison, Wisconsin. And she moved there because her wife was an emergency physician and they needed to relocate there for her job. Now, something along those lines is actually okay. People like it when people are leaving for good reasons, like they have to be closer to family and that sort of thing. So always having reasons that make sense, that have nothing to do with your performance in your last job. So people are always looking for cues that might show that you didn't do a good job in your last job, that you had problems in your last job, that you may be hard to manage in your last job. And so you have to stay very, very positive. You have to talk about how you really like the work, how you really like the people, and then, try to, steer the conversation another way. You can say often also that they didn't have enough work. Like, we don't have enough work. That's not your fault. It's the firm's fault. And maybe they let, a lot of people go. I had a situation again this morning where I was interviewing with a candidate that had left a firm, like I said earlier, with a partner who's leaving that had all the business. So they had like 6 associates there. All of them left, including himself, just because there was no more work. And that was a good reason for moving. I mean, it was, an excellent reason. So, that can be, even though it's a little negative, can be spun into something positive. So people will also ask you where else you're interviewing. Now, that's not a question that should be asked, but it's a question that is asked often, and you have to be very, very careful with that. It can definitely disqualify you for jobs if you answer in the wrong way. And many times attorneys that are interviewing are interviewing maybe at a small firm, and the firm is like, if you're interviewing big firms, then they're like, well, maybe that's where the person's going to want to go because they get more money, they're more prestigious. And so, you need to, respond in a very, very, careful way. This question isn't going to be asked very often. And again, it's inappropriate, but you have to be very, very careful with how you answer the question. And, most employers are not going to give you a position unless you're the first choice employer. Like almost every job offer that I get, I'm able to convince the law firm that they're their first choice employer. Law firms do not want to be rejected. It makes them feel bad about their brand. It makes the partners feel bad about, the people don't want to work there, undermines the partners because they feel like there's something wrong with their firm. So employer, really, is looking for you to say you're the first choice employer. So if you're interviewing a larger firm, you say, I want to move up. If you're interviewing a smaller firm, you say, I want to work with a firm that's more focused on my practice area, that, big law is difficult. I want to be in a place where I can make partner or big business. I mean, you have to have very, very good instances, very, very good reasons for, wanting, to work at the next place you go to, or you have to convince them that they would be your first choice. And so the employers may ask you to justify, why you're working at other employers, applying to other employers. If you tell them you've applied to other employers, they may ask which ones have interviewed you. And if you say none, then they think, well, maybe there's not a lot of demand for this person in the market, we're making a mistake. And so you have to be very, very careful, that you do that. So I have a personal story that's kind of interesting. I used to work in admissions for the University of Chicago admissions office. And, as part of that job, I had to interview a ton of people. Like I think one year, like over 3 days, I interviewed like 50 people because I couldn't find other people to interview them. And I didn't make the ultimate decisions about where the people would work, but my interviews with them really, because at the time, I mean, I think that Chicago had a very low acceptance rate, like maybe 5 or 6%. And they're also evaluated based on whether, how many admits they make and how many people go there. So they want to hire, I don't know if it's different now, but they want to bring in people that are, sold on them. And it's kind of a weird sell because, Chicago at the time wanted to, they're trying to bring in the same caliber of applicants that would, work, would get get offers from places like Harvard, Yale, and Stanford. And so they're interviewing those people that have the qualifications to get into those firms. And they know that if they select the wrong personality, that those people are not going to accept their offers. And so, I interviewed, all these people, and most of them very highly qualified. And, I would ask them where else they were applying. They would tell me, schools that had nothing to do with the type of culture and things at the University of Chicago. And I would, in those cases, let the school know that. And it was only the people that I was able to convince, see that they would be the first choice that typically would get offers. And that was very, very few of them. Chicago is not a popular school. It's a place where, people go and they have to work very hard. It's a certain type of person, that wants to study all the time, basically, that goes to that school. So, you have to understand, what they were thinking, and what they were thinking was, we're not going to admit people that don't want to go there. We're looking for certain types of personalities. We can tell that often based on their background. Like, for example, I would see, people apply and both their parents were professors at, different colleges. And because of that, they looked like, people that were out of academic environments. And that's the kind of people they were trying to hire. I admit the admissions office at the time was actually composed of PhD students. And so those PhD students probably liked those people from those backgrounds because maybe they would want to, interview, get interviews at those places. And, it's like that in Silicon Valley. There's very smart electrical engineers and stuff, or computer scientists that come out of Stanford and everything. And those firms and those candidates are often, more likely to go to Google or something if they're qualified than the small firm. So the small firm has to, make sure that the people that really want to work there, they need to sell them on a new technology or something that they might not be exposed to at Google. So, this happens all the time. And, when people are trying to get jobs at small law firms, they have to, really understand that, because the attorney's coming from much better law firm, it's unlikely that the person will stay or really wants a smaller law firm. And the candidate needs to do everything they can to convince the law firm that that's what they want. And And it's not, easy. I mean, you need to be able to convince people that that's your choice. And, and it's just, very, very important. So, when anytime you're answering that question, the most important thing you can do is give the firm the impression that the firm is your first choice and you have compelling reasons for want to working there. So, I mean, this is, one of the biggest mistakes that people make in interviews. Again, I see this all the time. When I tell you the ratio of interviews to offers, I mean, some firms it might be, 20 to 1. These are people make a lot of mistakes, and I'm, going through this today because I don't want you to make those mistakes. And I think, you're going to learn a lot today, and it's very admirable that you're on this because this is really, you want to decrease, if there's 10 interviews, at that firm before they make an offer. I mean, that means that people are doing stuff wrong, and it means that they're answering questions wrong. So, you must, in all cases, you need to figure out before you go into that interview why that firm's your first choice. You can't go in with an attitude that you're asking questions and you'll think about it and maybe you'll do it. I mean, you need to really make the firm believe it's your first choice. And if they made you the offer, you would do it. And you need to figure out how to really blow them away in the interview and make them think that. You don't go in and ask questions about salary and remote work and health insurance and all these different things or how many hours are required. You make it seem like whatever this firm is doing, whatever the work is, whatever the people there are, you may need to make them think that's your first choice. Now, you don't need to say it's your first choice, but you can go over the things they do that you just think are awesome and that would fit into what you're trying to do with your career. And if the employer believes that, then, telling, them where you're interviewing, I mean, by interviewing there can make things, you have a lot of ways to do that. And you need to convince the firm that you really want to work there based on your background and, the things in your background that, about the firm that would make you want to work there as compared to other places. So, you may know someone in the firm that said good things about it. I had an interview, a prep call with a guy the other day that he'd been doing insurance defense, and he wanted to go to a firm that was doing more sophisticated work, mass torts and products liability. And they decided to interview him. And he also knew, had grown up with his best friend. His dad was a partner at this law firm. So he went into the interview and he talked about, how he saw these good things about it when he was growing up, how it always been his dream to work there because of all the good things this guy said. And that really, it's pretty well done. Sorry about that. Give me a second. I have an automatic desk. That made the firm, really like him. And it made it seem like, he would work there. He heard good things about it and, and wanted to work there. This other example says computer work, but, you could put litigation work or real estate work or corporate work, like, anything in your background that talks about your interest in that practice area, things that are related to that practice area. So, when you're putting associations and grades and things on your resume, don't put associations that have nothing to do with your practice area. You should put things that have everything to do with your practice area. I've seen people get offers because, they say that, the firm is very close to them, to their house, and they would love to work, be easier for them. They can save the commute. You could say a smaller firm is more collegial or whatever you think. But you need to have reasons that you're really interested in that place. And really kind of go all out, making them feel like it's your first choice. Not necessarily without saying it, but providing them information, about, being interested in, applying to the place. So, what would people do applying to University of Chicago? They would come in and they would talk about how their parents or one of their parents went there and they've always wanted to go there. They could talk about, if they attended, school for summer school, they did work with a professor during high school, which has happened many times there. And, how their life, their career has been influenced by, their interest in their subject matter has been influenced by, work of some professor that they've read and things. So these sorts of things make it appear like, you have some sort of connection to the firm and you'd like to work there. When you can give answers like that are related to, reasons that you potentially want to work there. So, so you need to, again, the lesson here is like, whatever you do, you need to have evidence that shows that your first choice. You want to work there. You've known people. It's different reasons. They're more focused on your practice area. Different reasons that make them feel like it's your first choice because they don't want to interview people or hire people where it's not their first choice, that are kind of up in the air about making the firm sell them. You don't ask questions when you go into interviews about how the firm should sell you, because that, makes it seem like if they don't sell you well enough, you won't go there. You ask questions about things related to your practice area and compelling reasons for, wanting to work. So the law firms will also ask you if you're interviewing with other employers. And that's a common way to eliminate people from consideration. People do it all the time. You have kind of three different scenarios that could happen. One would be that, you're not interviewing with other employers, which is actually a very good reason. You're entirely interviewing with, not big firms if you're interviewing at a small firm. Or, you're interviewing with smaller firms and less prestigious firms, or only more prestigious firms, and if that's a prestigious firm. So let's talk a little bit about how you answer that. When you're not interviewing with other employers, that to some extent, you could worry about that sending a negative message to the firm that there's not a lot of, interest in you. And law firms want to feel like they're hiring someone that's very hard to get, that they're lucky to find that person. And it's, a pretty good, way for law firms to interview people. So, one thing that I like when people get just one interview, if it's true or not true, it doesn't matter, but, I guess it does matter, but you tell the firm that you've only applied to them, that, this is the only place you're interested in for these reasons. You don't think that, other places that you're familiar with would offer the same exposure to your practice area, or offer the things that you like about the firm. And you're not just out there interviewing, you're trying to improve, your career, and you believe this firm is one that could actually be very good for you. And so you need to, you can kind of promote it that way. So not interviewing other employers is actually a very good way of talking about, what you're doing in terms of where you're interviewing and so forth. That it typically goes over very well when you're able to answer questions that way. It also puts the firm in a position where if you're the only applicant, they know that if they make an offer to you, that you're likely to hire them. They're likely to hire you. So that as well is, it makes it seem like, you just know the market and you are interested in them. You've always wanted to work with them. You're familiar with the work. And when this particular opportunity came up, whether it's through a recruiter or on your own, or you just decided to send them an application, it makes them, feel very good that, if you get an offer, you're going to accept it. And that's exactly the type of people they want to hire. Now you have to have, good reasons that you potentially want to, work in the space. But other than that, that's kind of how you would approach it. So, sometimes, you may be interviewing you're interviewing entirely with less prestigious employers. So, if you're coming from a more prestigious, less prestigious employer that you're interviewing with, that's actually very, very good. Candidates get jobs quite often at firms that are much more prestigious than they're at. And typically the way they do that is they go into more prestigious firms. They say they want to work on more complex matters. It's always been their dream to work at a firm like this. They didn't, maybe they didn't get these type of jobs in law school for whatever reason. And people really like hiring people that are trying to move up, because if you were hiring like a second or third year attorney, and you have kind of all these people in your firm that, went to prestigious firms and went to schools, and then they left and they didn't necessarily like the job and all these other problems, then those are the kind of people they don't want. Like an attorney, moving from one big firm to another, typically, the reasons, whatever they are, may not be that great. So what people like, and lawyers like, and the whole American culture likes, is that, we want to try to help people that are moving up and improve their lot in life. That's what, most of our immigrants or, relatives who were, immigrants had to do. They came over here and they tried to move and improve themselves. It's very respected. People think that it's good when people are trying to improve themselves. This kind of psychology doesn't exist in, places like France and other countries where, you're kind of born into something and that's what you're expected to be. But when you're able to talk about moving up and wanting to improve, then they get the chance where they're hiring someone that is actually, going to be very dedicated, is going to work harder, has to prove themselves. And people like that. They feel like they're helping someone, and they like that, you're going to come into the job with a lot of enthusiasm. So, that's, very important. If you tell that same interviewer that you're interviewing with less prestigious employers, then they're going to think, well, maybe this person really isn't trying to move up, and maybe they're just trying to move sideways. They don't care. So you're often better off if you're interviewing prestigious law firms to tell them that, I'm only trying to get a job in firms like this because I really want to move up. I feel like I've done a really good job in my practice area. And, but I'm really, hungry for more prestigious work to work for larger employers. And the way it works, by the way, the more prestigious firm you go to, the larger the clients, the more money those clients have to spend. So you can look at matters in a lot of detail that you normally wouldn't at a smaller law firm where the clients that can't pay as much. So there really are benefits if you're trying to move up to a better firm. And by the way, if you are focused on one practice area and you want to move up, then that is very easy. I mean, it's not easy, but it's much more likely that that's going to happen. If you just talk about, making it clear to the employer that that's the kind of place you want to do. Sometimes people will be, working, applying to a mix of more prestigious and less prestigious employers. That's what most people do when they apply to applications. But you still apply to firms, but you still need to give them the idea that you're doing this for whatever reason because you want to get better experience in your practice area. But if you can, and I'm not again trying to tell you to be dishonest, but you can say, I've applied to a lot of firms like this, or I've applied to some firms like this that are similar. And, you don't have to tell them every place you apply because there's no way to know. You want to just try to focus and steer the conversation to firms that are, similar, to them in terms of size and, in terms of size and the practice area that they're in and so forth. So, what you have to talk about and what people like to hear is the fact that you need to go someplace that offers you something that's going to help you grow more than where you're at. So the firm wants to feel like you're going there not because you don't like your current employer, but because your growth is limited by the size of the clients, by being able to make partner in a large law firm, you have to get giant books of business, and where it's easier to get clients in a smaller law firm, it's better for your career. You have to basically make it seem like for whatever reason, your career is being limited by the firm you're at. And that's not saying anything negative. I mean, talking about the size of the clients, larger clients is not negative. Talking about wanting to work with smaller clients to get more hands-on experience is not good business. So you need to give the employer that you're interviewing with, it's very, very important. This is what the best interviewers do. This is what get people jobs. And again, this one thing is worth the price of admission to this webinar. I guess there is no price, but it's worth being here today because I'm really trying to get you to understand that you have to tell the firm, they have to believe that it's more growth potential. You're likely to stay if you get a job because it meets all your needs, and really make sure that they believe that, because they're going to interview a lot of people, and most of the people are going to come across without good reasons. They're not going to be prepared. They're not going to be able to talk about how this firm is going to help them grow and to go to a better firm. A lot of people get very discouraged, especially true with law students. Like they may not get a job in the summer, or they may get a job in the summer with a firm that's not that good. And then sometimes they'll fail the bar, or other times, they'll get a job in just a small firm that, that they really don't want to work in, but, whatever, it's all they can get. And, I can tell you with 100% confidence that if you focus when you're there, one practice area, and try to make your resume look like you're doing that practice area, and you want to move to a firm that does bigger work or has more clients, or whatever the reason is, you want to move to a firm for those reasons. Law firms love hiring people that are trying to move up. There is nothing wrong with wanting to work for more sophisticated clients. There's also nothing wrong with wanting to work with less sophisticated clients. You have to give the firm the impression that you like where you're at, you're doing great work, you're working for the most important partners and matters. You've been given matters that normally a partner would do, or normally a senior associate would do, and you're doing a good job on it. And so you talk about what a great job you're doing, but you just need to be in a place that's going to give you a better work. And that's why you're speaking to them. And, this is one of the most important things. If you can do this and understand how to present that, law firms like that, because it makes them feel like they have something that other people don't have, and they can offer you something that you're going to be grateful for. You're trying to move up, people respect that. And it's just, if someone's trying to move sideways, like from one big firm to another big firm, maybe there are okay reasons for that. But these are major American institutions that do like $1 billion or more a year sometimes. And, and having that as something that you're saying, regarding, why you moved and that you're moving sideways and stuff, it's not as attractive as someone that's trying to move up or move down for reasons that make it, move up. So, you have to, when you hire people, law firms are, choosing between, someone without compelling reasons for being interested in your company, which is very common. They'll walk into the interview, they'll think it's just like this, question and answer session. They won't realize that they have to give very, very good reasons for wanting to work there to everyone they talk to, that they would be grateful for the opportunity. But most people don't. I mean, they walk into interviews and they show absolutely no connection or interest with the firm. They ask questions that are about them, not the firm. They ask questions that could be embarrassing to the firm. I mean, I've seen people ask questions about, negative press stories and things, about the firm. I mean, I had a candidate once when I was a judicial clerk, and he had come in from New York or something, and was interviewing with, the two clerks and then also the judge, and then we took him out to lunch. And he did one thing. He was very highly qualified. I think he was from like NYU, we had great grades. And frankly, I was clerking for a federal district judge in a small town in Michigan, and he could have probably gotten clerkships at, I don't know, clerkships are better clerkships, but he came in and he said this was the only interview we had. And then he said there were these judge ratings that used to be published in these books and things, and people that were before the judge could say positive and negative things. And some people said negative things about him. And he's like, well, what do you think about that? And right then he just completely lost the job. Like he just, just by asking that question, it expressed doubt and not enthusiasm about working at the firm. I had another instance where I had this very skilled investment banker that was looking for a job after 2008. And he had, there was a recruiter that used to work for me that was writing these anonymous reviews about me because he was very mad about getting fired and negative things all over the place. And he, of course, had read them. And when we brought them up to him, he said, I don't pay any attention to that garbage. So you need to make the firm, and of course I hired him. And so you need to make whoever you're interviewing with feel like there's nothing wrong with them, like you respect them, like you don't take bad information seriously, you don't ask about it. And law firms have a choice of, someone that's very positive about their firm, between someone who's negative and on the fence, someone who needs, the environment of your firm to grow. These are the kind of people they hire. They don't want to hire people that aren't 100% committed to what they do. And this is what you need to do. You need to, come across as 100% committed to the law firm, that you'll take their side if there's negative information, that you'll cover people's backs, that you'll be a soldier and someone who's going to fight for them, and not someone who comes in with just, not a lot of enthusiasm. I had an instance where I had an opening that I wanted to hire someone who had just come out of law school. And so I called up UCLA Law School, and I asked them to send me resumes. This was in the fall. So they'd already graduated, people that were unemployed in their school and hadn't gotten jobs. And I interviewed several of them, like probably 10, because I was trying to find someone that would work out very well. And each of those people that came in, the UCLA is a good law school. A lot of them had very good grades. There was nothing wrong with backgrounds. But each of those people that came in, and again, this is working for me, it's not a huge law firm or anything, but each of those people that came in really, weren't enthusiastic. They had absolutely no enthusiasm. They didn't have compelling reasons for wanting to work for me, which they could have looked up articles about me and so forth. They didn't really articulate anything. They asked about salary. They didn't appear excited to be there. They didn't have the ability to sell themselves, and they didn't. Most of them had, didn't look me in the eye. A couple had really kind of lame handshakes. A few said, I'd only like to work here if I could be really challenged. And so just every single one of them rubbed me the wrong way. And then the school said, well, you have to meet this particular girl. She's amazing. So she came in and was just very happy about the opportunity to interview. She read articles about me, and she said, I'd love to work for you. She said, this industry looks so interesting. It would mean a lot to me to do this kind of job. And she was the one I hired, but the other 9 just didn't have anything. There was no connection. There was no interest. They were just kind of showing up. When you asked them questions, they didn't have any questions. They didn't express interest in the job. And so, that sort of thing is what disqualifies people. I mean, they need to come in with a lot of enthusiasm. And that's why those particular candidates, and of course, they were in Los Angeles, UCLA has candidates all over the country that probably didn't get jobs. That's how people get jobs. You have to know the firm. You have to be enthusiastic about the firm. You have to, show that there's a connection, because if there's no connection and nothing that appeals to you, then why would they hire you? They're going to hire the person with the most connection and who has the most enthusiasm. You would do the same thing if you were interviewing people. If you're interviewing people to be your nanny, you would do the same thing. I mean, everybody, does that. And people that have jobs that they can hire you for, they want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel like, you're offering them a very special opportunity that they wouldn't otherwise find, and that this is a great place to work. I can see why you like working here. That this is what a great platform, and you've had attorneys that have been here for 20 or 30 years. I mean, it must be a great place. You make people, you point out their good characteristics, you point out characteristics of the firm they might not have thought about, and make them feel like you really want them, and then that makes people feel good about themselves. People aren't going to hire people that don't make them feel good about themselves. Like, you have to go into the interview and really learn how to make people feel good about themselves. There's a lot of ways to do that. And some people don't necessarily learn that earlier in their careers or even throughout their careers, because being able to sell an employer is no different than being able to sell a client. So, as an attorney, you're expected to be able to sell particular clients at some point. So, you need to be able to sell yourself and have a great personality. There's a famous thing about Warren Buffett that's very, very interesting. And, I don't know if he went to college or where he went to college or what his background is, but behind his desk, he's got a framed certificate from taking a class. There's some class about human relations. It's an old class, and it's been around for a long time, and it's a popular class. And so this particular class, people, have been taking, for decades, 50 years. And so he's got this certificate that he completed this class, which, I don't know what it cost at the time. I think he said it was like $50 or something. And he took this class from Dale Carnegie, and you can look it up. And he said that, this class was, the best investment I've ever made. It's made me billions of dollars by taking this class. I have so much respect for it. And it's literally just, a certificate for the class he took. So, human relations, learning how to identify with people, learning how to get people to like you. Like, you may want to take that class because you can learn all this stuff, and learning it can change your career. It can change your life. And so, you need to be able to identify with people. You need to be able to show you're interested in them. You need to make them like you. There's all sorts of tactics and things that he has, like never saying anything negative, always using people's first name when you talk to them, over and over again, because people love to hear their name. There's also a book about it, but the classes can be really, really transformative to people. And I actually took it very early in my career when I was doing this, and it helped me tremendously. It helped me with candidates, it helped me found law firms, and really, changed the course of my life. So it's a very good class. Anything about human relations is very, very important. You need to make people you're interviewing with feel good about themselves. You make them feel respected. You make them feel the work they're doing is important. You make them feel like, you would love to work for them. You would give anything to work for them, and you really want to work for them. So, this particular characteristic and your ability to do it, I can't stress it enough. I think there's a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. You can read based on that, but the real strength of it is in the course. And I don't get anything out of promoting the course to you, but I would like to help you. And, and this is taking that class is one thing that, can help you. And the whole idea too of upward mobility is very important. So again, upward mobility can be going to a smaller firm or can be going to a larger firm. But what upward mobility means is it means that, wherever you're moving, it is what you want. It's exactly what you want. You've wanted for a long time. And so that upward mobility, being able to phrase things in a way that makes it seem like you're going someplace because you want to, because it means something to you, is very, very important. People do not want to hire losers; they want to hire winners. So losers will go into a job and be the only thing they can get, or they're not happy about it. Where winners will go into a job and they'll be able to convince people to hire them because they have a winning attitude, and they're not going there because they've gotten fired or something. They want to hire people that are winners and not losers. I had a very interesting thing happen. I think I talked about it maybe in the last webinar as well, but I had a candidate that was in Skadden, New York, and she was moving to like Martinsburg, West Virginia, and there's very few firms there that do important work. None of them do, as a matter of fact. And she moved there because of her husband, and she understood this. People a lot of times from Skadden and big New York firms like understand how to get people's confidence. And she went into like 6 interviews, and these interviews were, she might have been making, $400,000 a year job in SCADA, and these firms were paying like, 80,000, like 110. But she went in and just blew everyone away. Like this is exactly what she wanted. She, is done with big firms. She wants to go someplace where she can make a name for herself and all these things, and got every job, even though these weren't jobs that she particularly would want. She just knew how to play the game. And so this is a game. You need to learn the game. You need to learn sales. I mean, sales is, part of the game. I'm not suggesting you take sales courses. You may want to read some. My mentor, who's passed away, is named Chet Holmes. He wrote a book called The Ultimate Sales Machine, but he actually had a lot better information in a $3,000 course that was kind of a do-it-yourself thing that I took, but, very, very important. So, talking about other interviews in a way that makes them seem like upward mobility is important. And then not, if you're interviewing with big firms, really trying to emphasize that's all you're doing. If you're interviewing smaller firms, emphasize that's all you're doing. People want to hire people that are like guided missiles going into a certain type of job. And it's what you need to do. And this girl from SCADA, I mean, she could have gone to these interviews all depressed that she had to take these jobs that were kind of beneath her pay grade and everything. But she didn't. She went in and, convinced every firm to hire her. And then later she was able to negotiate her salaries a little bit. But this is how it works. This is what you need to do. You need to sell yourself. And, I will say just at the outset that for some reason, attorneys at New York are very, very good at this. I don't know if it's because of the competitive environment and how things work there, but they're very good at selling themselves. And, attorneys from big firms, not all, but most of them. So you need to learn that skill. Okay, so there's other questions that come up about how you did in law school, if you got bad grades, all that sort of stuff you can be asked. And people, it's not as rampant as it once was, but it's actually, it's something that does come up a lot. You have bad grades and you're worried about them, and you're worried that you won't get a job. And is it something that you want to talk about or don't want to talk about? So, the kind of the importance of grades and how that works is, when a law firm is interviewing people to be a first-year associate, they have a lot of options. They want to choose people from the best school that they can and the people with the best grades that they can. That's really all they have to compare you to other candidates. Now, sometimes people have all this experience, like they might have been, I don't know, like a chemical engineer for several years, and then they went to law school, and then they became a patent attorney, and now they're chemical stuff, and law firms don't pay a lot of attention to their grades. But the grades really start going down. They become less and less important when you become a mid-level, then you become a senior associate, and then a partner. And the reason is because there's, the only way that law firms compare you to other students when you're in law school is based on your grades. But once you get experience, the only thing comparing you on that I've been looking at the most seriously, and there are some law firms that will continue looking at your grades throughout your career, like Gibson Dunn and some other big firms. But in general, that once you become an expert in a certain practice area, then that's what they have. And so I was talking to a woman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin today that was trying to get a job as a healthcare attorney. And she, her grades, she had done nothing but healthcare law like her entire career before she went to law school. And that particular resume, got her from a third-tier law school, which she didn't have great grades, into a major law firm right out of graduation because she had that experience. But most, junior attorneys or law students do not have that experience. So at each stage of your career, grades are going to become less and less important. And the most important thing is going to be, your practice areas. And, sometimes, larger firms will continually, look at your practice area, your experience there, and and also your grades, but there's not really much you can do with grades. But people all the time move from, firms where they don't have good grades and they concentrate, more in their practice area, and then they become more marketable. So as a law student, you should do whatever you can to make sure that you get into firms where where you have experience and where you get experience in one practice area instead of that's what's going to make you marketable to bigger firms later. And bigger firms later are going to start not even looking at firms will stop looking at grades. So law students, yeah, that's a big deal. Where you went to law school is a big deal. That's typically based on your LSAT score, so and your grades. So that's how you get into law school. And so you're measured based on those scores, and you get into schools based on that. But then later on, once you get past that and you become, even a junior associate, there's very few people like you that in your practice area, hopefully, And so you can start moving to better and better firms. The firms do not have, they don't really emphasize them a lot. All they want at that point are people that are trained in a practice area. And that's again why it's so important to be trained in one practice area. That's what the law firms are looking for, when they start interviewing people to be lateral attorneys. That's it. They will sometimes look at grades, but often they won't even look at grades. I had a funny thing happen once with a woman. She went to the University of Minnesota Law School and had some of the worst grades I'd ever seen in my career. They were like C's, D's, and then I don't know, it was just ridiculous. But she had gotten a clerkship with a federal appellate judge, which is very, very hard to do, that apparently didn't look at her grades. She was on law review, which she probably wrote onto, and I don't know how she got a law review. And so they looked at that. They looked at, she got this clerkship. And then after her clerkship, she got hired at one of the most prestigious firms in Silicon Valley. And they didn't look at her grades because they figured, after this clerkship, she's just like an amazing catch and everything. And so they didn't look at her grades. And then when she left that firm, the next firm assumed that she was working at this big firm, and they must have checked her grades and everything and never asked for her grades. So, sometimes you can get away with not having good grades. It's very, very rare. But once you start moving and, once you get a couple of years of experience, there's very few people like you. So let's say I had a candidate today get an interview in Omaha, Nebraska, and he was doing a certain type of tax law that was just, not a lot of people like him, but didn't have good grades in law school, and then ended up, getting a job with this, or getting an interview with this more prestigious firm, and they didn't look at his grades. There's a funny thing that happens also. I'll tell you this pattern because I want to show you how grades stop being that important. The farther you're, the more, the longer you're practicing law. So, and this is the examples for patent attorneys. So patent attorneys typically go to major in sciences and math and that sort of thing, or physics. And in those types of classes in colleges, they often have very strict curves. There might be like 1A in a class and, 8 Bs and, 3 B minuses and, but it's very, very difficult to get good grades in those types of classes compared to like social science if you're majoring in psychology or something. So those attorneys will not have good grades. And even if they do well in the LSAT, they always end up going almost all the time to second and third year law schools. And then when they get out, their grades are often, their science people are often not that great in law school either. And then when they get out, they start at these small patent firms. But then they write all these patents and they do all this work and then they have a good resume. And then after a couple of years, when they apply to large law firms, the large law firms are no longer looking at their grades, they're looking at their expertise. And there's very few people like that. I don't know what the percentage of attorneys, but if there's 100 people in your class, maybe 1 or 2 become patent attorneys. So trained patent attorneys become very scarce, and law firms do not have to use your grades to evaluate you anymore. So you're not going to get a lot of questions about your grades when you get more senior. Another thing I recommend, and this is a very important tip for resumes, this alone could get you more jobs. What a lot of people do is they're very proud of their grade point average. They may list that they got a 3.0 or 3.3 on their resume, and you don't want to ever highlight weaknesses. Now, if you were, order the COI for something or magna cum laude, then you can list that, but you don't want to list anything to do with your grades. Why would you draw attention to something that, is not exceptional? You take that stuff off. You never want to draw attention to anything that can give that, if your grades aren't good, why would you put that out for the law firm to see? I mean, maybe someone who's reviewing it only wants to hire people with the best grades. You just don't, really want to look at it. And so, there's been all these times, in history, not a lot of them, but, 1998 or 2000, there was this like huge demand for corporate attorneys all over the country. And everybody wanted corporate attorneys, and then grades were essentially ignored. Like, so big firms would ignore them. People just wanted to get people in the door. And then, mid-level to senior associates, the grades become much less important as you go through. And then when you're a senior associate, it's really just about your skill in your practice area. But everything you've done at that point speaks for itself. Grades, why would they use your grades to evaluate you when they have your experience? That's what they're hiring for. So you need to think about, every level of your career, grades are going to go down in importance. They're going to be important when you're a law student. But if you go into a firm where you're getting a certain type of experience, you can always move up and do better and better. And sometimes people will get into these practice areas that are like consumer facing. So they may be doing personal injury, or they may be doing trust and estates, or they may be doing insurance defense, or things where they're working for individuals as opposed to companies. And so what do you do in that situation? What do you do when, when you're not getting, when not, in that particular situation. So, you just need to really think, be very careful about, anything to do with grades as you get more senior. Then partners, I've rarely heard them ask for partner grades. I mean, it hardly ever happens. All they're concerned about is your expertise in your business and in your practice area, and then how much business you have. It's just so grades will gradually, go down as you get more experience in the practice area. So you need to always concentrate on making sure that you get as much experience in your practice area, because that's what they will evaluate you on. They're not going to evaluate you, how your grades were. It's stupid. I mean, they need someone that does a certain type of work. You're trained in that work. So why would they ever make grades something? It's just you've done the work, you understand what you're doing. And keep in mind the whole idea of the patent attorneys. Almost always patent attorneys will move up in terms of the prestige of the firm. And and so grades become less important. So, when you're asked about grades in your interview, sometimes you can just say, I really like my classes in whatever the practice area you want to do it. I really like my practice in corporate law. I really like my classes in, related to litigation, whatever. And I wasn't so good at property and other things. That's okay to say. I mean, you can talk about, how things relate to your practice area, you got good grades, and then ones not related to your practice area, you didn't. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion about clothes you wear in an interview, but the basics are, you always need to dress up for interviews. You should put on a suit. Even if it's a Zoom conference, you should, look good for, dressed up for any interview, because that, really, connotes a certain message of professionalism. It's what you would do if you're meeting with clients. So, dressing down and that sort of thing is just not really something that, works very well. I mean, you won't get jobs if you do it. I remember when I was at a firm like Quinn Emanuel, they had this crazy dress code where anybody could wear shorts and sandals to the office, and people did. But if people showed up for interviews, then they would know about this dress code. Dressed like that, they would never get jobs. So it's just a sign of respect to dress up. You want to look your absolute best, and you really want to look as strong as you possibly can in terms of your dress. I mean, very focused on that. Another story I'll tell you, which is kind of interesting. I was at my summer after my second year of college. I went to work in this big New York law firm, prestigious law firm that is no longer around. It was actually not that firm. I worked there. It was called Reed and Priest, and it was an old law firm. It was actually the oldest law firm in New York, and there was one partner there that had a massive book of business. Like I don't know what it was, but at the time it was, the largest in the firm. And, he said to all the associates that, when you walk into a room, like you need to be the best dressed, you need to look like, the most serious, you need to have the most presence, because that's what clients are looking for. Clients are looking for leadership. Like they're looking for someone that they can spend money on, that looks like they have leadership. And so, I always remember that, because when you do that, you're able to really convey a message to firms about how seriously you take the interviews. And I think that, that is very important. Now, there's some stuff in this book that I'll send to you after the interview. I'll send you the book. So I'm going over some stuff from the book, and then you can follow up and read it. It's long, but it might help you. So a lot of times people go into interviews and they're nervous. They just, they're nervous about the interview. They really want to get the job. They're afraid of not doing well. They have all these issues, just getting nervous in interviews. And, they do things like stammer, they'll fidget, they'll say things like, and stuff over and over in the interview, and they're not relaxed. And so, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You need to really make sure that you give firms the idea that you're interested in them, that if you can't control your nervousness, that's why I'm nervous. And law firms actually like that a lot of times. It can work to their advantage. And I've had a lot of candidates get jobs that were extremely nervous in interviews and just weren't able to do well because they were just so nervous. So, one example, this is recently, I had a candidate that had failed the bar twice at a firm called Richard Finger at Delaware, and had lost his job. And, because he was unemployed and he'd lost his job for failing the bar twice, he was having a very difficult time getting interviews. And, he came to me and he kind of bought into my whole system, which is applying to every place you can possibly find that could use you. And he got an interview with a firm and went into the firm, and the firm, the partner in the firm was a small firm, interviewed him, said he was just incredibly nervous and, having issues like, and so the partner called me and told me this, and I was able to spin it in a positive way. I said, yeah, of course he's nervous. I mean, this is a big deal to him working for you. He hasn't had a lot of options. And if you hire him, he's probably going to be the hardest worker you ever hire because he doesn't want to screw up again. And so people like, that's a way to spin it. If you are nervous in an interview and it comes across as nervous, you can say, I'm sorry, I'm nervous, but this is just, this is a place where I really want to work and I don't want to screw up and things like that. I mean, you can certainly, make it work to your advantage. When I was practicing law, there was a partner, an associate. No, there's a partner that was giving us a talk about how to bring business. And he said that the guy with the most business in LA is also the biggest nerd in LA. Like just, but he was able to, even though he was nervous, he was able to, communicate how good and focused he was in this practice area in a way that other people couldn't. So nervousness is, something that, is important to work on. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some kind of motivational things that I think are important in terms of your ability to get a sense of self and to be, someone that, is, very respected by, when you go into interviews, it's able to get interviews and to do well, and how you kind of need to change your outlook in terms of what's possible for you in terms of jobs and things you can do in your career. I had a friend when I was growing up, extremely arrogant. He'd inherited several $1 million from his mother when she died and didn't have a relationship with his father. He felt very highly of himself. He'd always been very rich. And, he said he was going to work in these large investment banks. And, and even if he wasn't a great student, he was still going to achieve all these things. And he had just an incredible level of self-confidence. And, and even if he received, negative feedback, he still had this sense of self-confidence. His self-confidence was so extreme that, he'd go out and meet people outside the school and people would, beat him up or hit him and stuff. And but he still believed in himself. And when I was younger, I was sitting in his BMW convertible and discussing like what we were going to do with our, futures in the future. And he told me he was going to work for a major investment bank and, make millions of dollars. And when I came to share my plans, I certainly didn't have anywhere near, the self-confidence he did. And I said, I'd be happy to, get a 3-bedroom house and, a neighborhood like this. And hopefully I can travel once in a while, and hope I can get a good job out of college, and I managed to get something. So it wasn't like anybody expressing any type of enthusiasm for their future. I certainly didn't think I'd be an attorney or go to college. I, didn't have those kind of thoughts about myself. And so, the people that I surrounded myself, like him, never gave me the idea that I could do these things. And, and so I think at that time, I, was around people that didn't have big plans for life except for this guy. And, so, most people, if you have a strong sense of self, this is, a very good thing to have. I mean, it's going to help you, recognize, think highly of yourself and actually not be nervous in interviews. I mean, having, succeeding academically, doing the best you can, contribute to your sense of self. I mean, sometimes people will become really good athletes and that will help develop their sense of self. Sports teams and things. Sometimes people get it through the religion. That's very common. Sometimes people will strive to have really good relationships, and that'll be important. Your occupation, gives you that. But the things you've done in the past give you a sense of self. And so, you need to, develop and believe in yourself that, there's certain things, that you can always do, and you have confidence, and, that, you're around people that are encouraging you to be better, in environments that are encouraging you to be better, and not environments where people don't have a high sense of self, like where they're not enthusiastic about what they can achieve. And there's a show called Bake Car where groups of people steal cars and try to get away, and there's different people involved. And a lot of times people are in those groups because they want to feel accepted. It's that way with you live in a bad neighborhood with criminals, the odds are that you'll probably become a criminal. So you need to really believe in yourself. I'm not trying to get political here, but I was watching briefly some show about Donald Trump, like his history, and doing building in New York and so forth. And he always believed that he would do things no matter what. He could always achieve anything he wanted. And that was, tremendous arrogance. But that sense of self enabled him to do a lot of the things, regardless of whether you like him or not. He takes taken all sorts of criticism, and he just doesn't. He's unwavering. I mean, he just can charge him with crimes. You can make him pay money. You can do whatever, and he will continually, have that strong sense of self. And if you have that strong sense of self, you're going to be more successful, and you're going to live better lives. And frankly, some law firms will kind of break you. They'll make you feel that this is all you can have, and you won't feel happy, and you'll be kind of often you feel like you're a prisoner to this profession. And people with a strong sense of self often, they get ahead in law firms, and if they don't, then they go out and they believe that they can do more, and they start their own law firms, or they start companies after failing the bar multiple times. And you just need to have a strong sense of self that you can really, achieve anything that you want to achieve, and that you have power within you to do that. Two things that sort of changed my life in terms of, what I became and what I wanted to become was, after, actually it was in my last year of high school, I started reading like self-improvement books. I read like Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, which is just an amazing book because it gives you kind of all these insights into things that you can do to really have, to be successful, to believe in yourself, and to have self-confidence. It's just an amazing book. I mean, you don't even have to buy it. It's there's no copyright, so you can just find a copy of it online. But that book is very, very helpful. There's also, I was influenced a lot by Anthony Robbins, and it's the same thing. Like, you need to believe in yourself. You can do things. And that is also very, very powerful. But unless you have a powerful sense of self, people are going to walk all over you. And people want to hire people that are confident, have a strong sense of self. And if you're nervous and you can't shake that, then you can fix it by, trying to figure out ways to believe in yourself when the world may not be giving you that sort of input. So again, highly recommended you work on that. This one thing can make a massive difference in your career. It can make you more successful. It can make you happier. It can make you achieve things that you never thought possible once you develop that. And anyone can do it. You just need to, stop thinking about all the negativity in your life and think about the positive things in your life. And that's, by the way, who clients want to hire. Clients want to hire and do business with people that have a very strong sense of self and believe in themselves, and can convince them to use them as a rubric, as a client. And also law firms want to hire people with a strong sense of self. They want to hire people that are going to get out there and be very impressive to clients, that will know exactly what they want. They want to be a partner, whatever, they want to get ahead. And that's the kind of people who get hired. You get hired when you have a strong sense of self, and not when you don't. So very, very important. So there are differences between interviewing with big firms and small firms and mid-sized firms, and I'm not going to go too far into this, but people ask about this all the time because they get interviews and they're like, I got to look into this firm some more and see what's going on. It's a small firm, whatever. But typically large law firms, they over time develop very well-defined procedures. They know how to interview. They have systems and things in place, and it's just much different. And the smaller firms are often much less formal. It's going to be more about your individual connections and those things in terms of less more so than interviewing, with large law firms. Now, this is kind of the way it works. And I don't know why it's this, and it's always been this, but most attorneys will take jobs with the firms that they believe are the most prestigious. I've seen people just make horrible mistakes doing this. I had one candidate years ago that was like a diehard, like Republican, society, all this stuff, and he was in San Francisco. And there's hardly anybody like that in San Francisco. I mean, but he found a firm that was like that, and they really connected with him. They really liked him. They really wanted to hire him. And then he got an offer from a big firm in New York City. And then he chose the more prestigious firm, not the one that identified with him, that he identified with. He chose, made a decision about a firm that, in my opinion, was not right for him. And he went there and he found himself working like 25 or 2,800 hours a year for 2 years. And he was so exhausted at the end of those 2 years that he quit. And he just spent years just kind of bouncing around as a contract attorney and stuff in different places. And so, something like that happening, you need to be, very aware of in terms of making a decision sometimes for firms that, that, that are the best firms, but, you may find if they're a smaller firm. So, yeah, okay. So most attorneys would choose a firm based on prestige level, which I think is dangerous. The most prestigious firms, it's harder to make partner. Often it's impossible to make partner. You can, so you can have a lot of, things there. Attorneys that don't get into the most prestigious firms following, law school, they often just continue trying. They keep applying again and again and again, hoping that these prestigious firms will hire them. And it's very hard to get that done. And you have to be very specialized in a certain practice area and have enough experience there that the law firm's willing to take a chance on you. And typically, if you're, coming from a small firm, what you need to do is you need to make sure that when you're moving, maybe you move to a mid-sized firm first, and then after you get experience at a good mid-sized firm, then you can try to work in a larger law firm. But in most cases, you have to, only the large law firms are only going to hire you if you're, being able to have a skill and stuff that, really makes a difference. So I've talked a little bit about already the sense of importance about, working in a firm, one reason or why reasons that attorneys will turn down often, higher paying positions to do different types of work. Law firms, candidates are attracted typically to firms that, make them feel important, inspired. And so, you need to really feel that. You need to feel a sense of connection with the people. You can't just go into like a firm where you don't have that sense of connection, like my friend did, but you go into a firm where, you have a sense of connection. And, and oftentimes, smaller law firms that have a really good kind of value proposition for what it's like to work there, and so forth. A lot of them are able to attract attorneys from very large firms because they give people a purpose and they might have prestige because of the quality of attorneys there, but the attorneys are also have a sense of purpose. And so, that's very, very important. And I won't go into a lot of this detail here. Let's see here. Yeah. So, one of the things, well, this is a little bit about how firms can, make people feel important. And, it's important that you try to feel important. This firm, had fewer than 5 attorneys 15 years ago, and it's grown to over 100. And there was one hiring partner in the firm. And whenever he saw a resume from someone he liked, he would immediately call them and say, something to the fact that he gets hundreds of resumes a week and he just throws most of them in the trash. But, he tells the candidate that, he hasn't seen a resume like this in a long time. He tells the candidate this is a small firm. It's one of the best firms in the United States with all these special graduates from different schools. And even though the young recruit hasn't heard of the firm, he's able to, get them in it by making them feel important. So, the same thing, within the firm that Canada reaches there. So, you need to, understand like what type of firm you're going to go to at different points in your career. And often moving to a smaller firm is actually, very important. So this is just some things that firms will do to make you feel important, the culture, the different things, so the social perspective. And if a firm is actually able to reach out to you and make you feel these things, then it actually probably is a really good place to work. Law firms that aren't growing often don't have a real value proposition other than they pay a lot. It's very difficult to tell a lot of firms from one another that are large. They hire people and pay them a lot, but it's very similar in terms of the decision to join firms. These are just some issues about attorneys, money, a little bit about boutiques, which I think I've talked about so far a little bit. But people do like often to go to boutiques, but there's also significant differences between large law firms and small firms. And so when you're moving to a smaller firm, I mean often you want to look at things like culture, clients, the viability of the firm. All these different things are pretty important to to understand. Now, this particular question is one that's very important that you understand how to answer, because when you're interviewing with different people in a law firm, there's different things that you need to say. And so typically when you're interviewing with a law firm, you'll be speaking with partners, you'll be speaking with junior partners, senior associates, and you'll be speaking with associates at all levels. And the thing to understand about your different audiences is that, associates typically, and sometimes even junior partners, are in competition with each other. They're trying to build the most hours. They're trying to make the most connections with, partners. They're trying to, they're competitive with each other. They're trying to get the best work from the best partners. There's just a lot of competition when attorneys are young, very hungry to get ahead. And that's one reason that law firms prefer to hire younger attorneys instead of more senior attorneys. But these attorneys that you're interviewing with, they are looking at you and not as someone that would be a good fit for their firm. I mean, they certainly may be thinking that you might be a good cultural fit or and like you, or you could be their friend. But really what they're looking for is this person going to outshine me? And if they do, they're going to be not as inclined to give you good reviews. They will find other things wrong with you, not the fact you want to work so hard, not that you're going to make them look better. So you do not go in and, talk to associates you're typically interviewing with in a way that you're just going to be the top performer and all this sort of stuff. They're not going to like that because that's going to impact how they look to different people. So you don't really want to go in and try to impress people too much when you're interviewing with, people that are associates and maybe junior partners to some extent that don't have a lot of stability. But you want to go in and, give them the impression that you do good work, you'll be committed, and try to connect with them because a lot of times they're looking for friends. I mean, people that will work with them and that aren't going to outshine them and be, talk to them and go out drinks with them and things. They're looking for something much different than, than what an associate would. Associates are often threatened by you. So if someone is threatened, they're much less likely, to want to hire you. I mean, that's really one of the main things they're looking for. So, they will look at your school sometimes and be impressed with that, but anything that you say to them that makes it look like you could be better than them or do better work than them or anything is going to make them not like you. So a lot of people don't realize this. It's often associates that give bad reviews that can tank your interviewing. So you just need to come across as, someone that does good work, someone that's likable, someone that has good reasons for moving, someone that could be their friend. All those sorts of things are incredibly important when you're interviewing with senior associates. Okay, so then there's a typical associate partner interview. So partners are actually much more secure in their jobs. And because they're secure in their jobs, they're going to be concerned with, sometimes your grades, but really your ability to work hard. They want to hire people that are going to be respectful to them, that are going to carry out the work that they need, that are hopefully going to bill a lot of hours, that, are going to work really, really hard. They're going to appreciate the job and really buy into everything the firm offers and work very, very hard to make the money. That's pretty much what they want. So you need to come across to partners that, you will work incredibly hard. You are very enthusiastic about this opportunity. And they're typically the ones that, associates can give you bad reviews, of course, but partners are really often the ones that are going to be most important in terms of you getting, you getting hired. So partners, just you work extremely hard. You're completely dedicated, like all those sorts of things. Because what happens in a lot of firms is, certain people will, lose that drive and then they'll get new jobs. And so bringing in someone often even from a lower ranked firm into a bigger ranked firm that's going to appreciate the job is also very attractive to them. So you need to really do the best you can when you're interviewing with, partners and give them the impression that you're just all out and then not intimidate associates in your interview. So just, to talk about lunch. I don't know that this stuff is that important. Some of this is very obvious about not drinking alcohol. One of the big mistakes people make in interviews is they get too comfortable. They share too much information. They try to act like they're friends with the people they're interviewing with. They don't give attention to several people in the interview. They connect with others and they don't try to talk to others, which they want you to do. So this is basically a chance for people to get comfortable with you in a social situation. And if you're able to do that, then it typically works. But, just some basic things like you don't really want to drink alcohol. You can talk about your interest outside of practicing law that makes you more human, which is often the point of the interviews, things so they can personalize you and see that you're actually a real person. So they like that, talking about hobbies and, all sorts of things that are related to that. Now people are doing Zoom calls, and that's very, very common. So the same thing applies. You want to make sure that you look your best, that you have a neutral background, that you have your resume ready. If I want to talk about that, so you're looking at your resume, and then just some other basic things like I had an interview with a candidate today and she couldn't get her camera to work and then she couldn't get her microphone to work. And so, you obviously don't want to have that happen when you're trying to get into a Zoom call. You need to check all that stuff in advance. And then, other things, just looking at the camera, having a neutral background are very important. And people do a lot of Zoom calls these days. There's just some big mistakes I saw people make. I had a candidate in Orange County recently, and he'd gone on like 3 Zoom calls and interviews, and each one of them probably rejected him. And the reason is in his background, he had this kitchen that was just piled up with dirty dishes, and there was like a pair of shoes on his counter, and it was just ridiculous. And so that particular background said a lot about the kind of guy he was, and he was getting rejected. So we cleaned that up. So just be careful with your Zoom backgrounds. Always, arrive to the Zoom calls like 5 minutes early. So, if they log in early, you're there. But to just, do the same things you would do in normal interviews in terms of arriving early. And by the way, when you're interviewing with a firm for like a live interview, you should always, arrive, at least 5 minutes early. Be very nice to the receptionist, thank her, and so forth. And people make this mistake all the time. Like they may come across as rude to the receptionist, and then the receptionist will get involved in making a decision about the person, saying they were rude, and they'll not hire the person based on that. So you need to, really kind of be aware of, how that's going to work. I mean, what you do when you go in for interviews. So there's just a lot of people that are confident about interviews and, not confident about interviews. When you're interviewing, with a firm, there's a lot of things that you need to do to prepare and prepare questions, that are, important. So I talked a little bit before about, why you're looking, what brings you here, like what is it that, you're interviewing, what's going on. And, and a lot of times people just don't fit in with the cultures that they're in. They don't seem to get along with people. And, culture, by the way, is very, very important. A lot of times attorneys will join a firm and they'll just have a terrible experience. They won't like it. And they don't understand that, like, maybe this type of person or this type of group is not the type of group that they fit in with. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, different people fit in with different types of people. So, that's also, a reason, that you can move, and you should feel confident when you're going out interviewing. By the way, when I work with candidates, and a lot of candidates don't like this and they don't go along with it, but I try to get them exposed to, a high number of firms because, they can always find a culture that works for them if they interview with enough people. But, you have to, be very, very careful about the things you say. You can't say you're leaving because of the hours. You can't say, anything negative about your firm. Again, the most important thing you need to say is that you're trying to find a place that has more work. You're trying to find a place with bigger clients. You're trying to find a place with, a culture that you're comfortable in. I mean, all these sorts of things can help you, get a position. Now, there's another thing that I need to bring up, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call have this issue is maybe you're unemployed and looking for a job. So that is the hardest way to get a position is when you're unemployed. The reason it's hard is because if you're unemployed, it connotes that maybe you quit and just didn't think, you could handle the job, or it connotes you were fired. And, if you're fired, that's not good, or it connotes you were laid off. If you're laid off, that's not good. The reason it's not good being laid off is because most of the time when firms lay people off, they let go of the people they don't like the most or the people that aren't the highest performers. So, you need to be very careful if you go into an interview and you're not working. So, there's a lot of answers you can give to that. You can give an answer that the work was very slow, which is a good answer. There wasn't anything to do. You can give an answer that, talks about that you needed time off for various reasons, or you just, you lost your job and you haven't started looking until recently. And the problem with all these reasons is that, you're going to be disqualified from a lot of firms. So what does that mean? Large law firms are not going to want to interview someone from a certain background if that person, is if they can find people that, I mean, if you're unemployed, if they can find people that are employed versus unemployed. And, I've seen, what you need to do when you're in that position. It's actually not that hard to fix. If you're in a major market like New York City, for example, there's more than enough applicants for every job. So they have no reason or inclination to hire people that are unemployed because those candidates, they can find people that are employed. So, why would they hire someone that's unemployed? So in big markets, it's very, very difficult if you're unemployed to get positions, especially at the most prestigious firms, because, who would you hire? Someone that's employed and, or someone that's unemployed. So what do you do in that situation? Well, it depends on your practice area. So, certain practice areas don't pay a lot of money and they just kind of need bodies. That's often like personal injury or insurance defense or, different things like that, where it may not matter that you lost your job. But then there's other firms that may have very good work that you could work in that you can apply to that are in smaller markets. And often the smaller market firms won't ever see people with your qualifications. And so you will have a good opportunity of getting jobs there. I do this all the time. I move people from, large markets to small markets when there's no interest in them and that. So, if you're unemployed, people will overlook it, but they're more likely to overlook it in smaller markets as opposed to, different, as opposed to larger markets and larger firms. Okay, questions. So one of the things that's important in all interviews is being able to, having the ability to, talk or to listen to questions. And what do I mean by that? So you want to put yourself in a position, and if you do an interview right, your interviewer is going to be talking most of the time about subjects they're interested in. So your ability to get them to talk a lot about subjects they're interested in will make you like them. There's a story that another mentor of mine named Jay Abraham talked to me about one time, and he had gotten on a plane, and I don't know where it was going, but it was like a 5-hour flight, and he thought, what would it be like to ask this person a bunch of questions on the plane and get to know him and just listen to what he had to say. So he just asked this complete stranger a bunch of questions and got the guy talking. And 5 hours after the flight, Jay had hardly said a word. And the guy said, "This is the most interesting conversation, I think I've ever had. I want to stay in touch. Here's my card. And, I'd love to, get to know you and know more and stuff." So, but the point being that when people talk about themselves, they're, they tend to like you. And so you want to try to get interviewers to talk as much as you can about themselves and but not just about themselves. You don't ask them like dull questions about the law and things like that. You get them to talk about subjects they're interested in. It could be a case or a deal or something, but you need to really do what you can to allow them to talk. And then your answers, I talked about a little bit earlier, mistakes that I made when I was interviewing people before, when I was, giving long-winded answers. And you want to basically be prepared to give, shorter answers. Just another few things that are important are, being able to do your homework, meaning make a connection with the interviewer, understand the type of work they do, read everything you can about their website, search Google for information about the person, find things that you may like. If you don't get a list of people you're interviewing with, then do what you can to connect with them, by knowing a lot about the firm, and then not just knowing it, but finding reasons to like it once you interview. Lateral moves, I talked a little bit about that, how to accomplish that. I think I've done, a good job on covering that, that you want to go to, different firms for different reasons. A lot of times, most of the time, by the way, not for every attorney. And like I said earlier, there are attorneys that if you get them into an interview, will always get the job. But many times, people will, go on interviews, and literally you can go on 10 interviews and not get an offer, and you don't know what happened. After getting interviews, you just don't know what you did wrong. And, it's really more about, your ability, and I'll just, give you some examples. It's about your ability to connect with the interviewers and give them what they want. And if you do that, then you're going to be in a very good situation. You have to come across as a type of person that you would want to hire if they were your attorney. So, how would a really good criminal law attorney, if you got accused for murder, what kind of criminal law attorney would you want to hire? You'd want to hire someone who was confident, who had done a lot of cases, that had won cases, that that you could put your trust in and believe that that person could help you. So, this is, very important, for you to realize is that, just because you go on 10 interviews and don't get a job, it just means that you need to recalibrate. You need to read this book. You need to watch this video, but you need to understand that the way you're coming across, you need to come across as like a winner, someone that's got confidence and someone that is going to connect with them. And that's it. I mean, it's not that hard to do. And if you do it, you're going to, do better. I see it's very sad. Like I have candidates all the time that will go on, I've had this happen so many times in my career. They'll go on a bunch of interviews and they won't get jobs and they'll just give up on the practice of law. Like they'll give up on the practice of law when there's just so many opportunities out there. There are thousands of law firms, thousands of places you can work. I mean, some people will only look at big firms and get interviews and not get jobs, or some people will, go out on interviews and just not be prepared, not getting jobs. And you have to listen to everything I'm talking about today, because what I'm talking about is ways that you can get positions, even when, compared to other people. I mean, you have to have confidence. You have to believe in yourself. You have to research the firm. You have to make connections. You have to have a story for why you're interviewing with. You can't feel sorry for yourself. You've got to feel, very good about yourself. So you need to do whatever you can, to come across that way. But don't drop out of the practice of law because you don't get any interviews. I mean, I've had so many candidates that, are effectively, closed out of big city markets. Like I had a corporate attorney in, where was she, in Palo Alto, that her boyfriend had committed suicide. And so she quit her job and, sat around like very depressed for like 6 months. But it sent her resume to every firm in Silicon Valley, but that particular market is like overflowing with corporate attorneys. So why would they hire her? She only had 6 months of experience. But so she actually didn't get any interviews. But then, I started sending her all over the country to Akron, Ohio, and, smaller markets. And she started getting like tons of interviews. I think she had like 10 interviews. And not only that, but, she interviewed well. So she was getting offers, and then she wasn't taking offers. And, so anytime you're having a hard time, you're not closing interviews or whatever, you just have to look at smaller firms and smaller markets and then improve your game. Read the books I've talked about. Just do whatever you possibly can to get the position. Other questions like, why did you interview for the position? You have to, again, your resume should be very, very focused on your practice area. I can't stress this enough. And then you have to know things about the firm, and, you want to, really see, reasons that you interviewed there. If the firm's small, you have to have reasons for that. If the firm's larger, you have to have reasons for that. But you need to, really, do a good job of this. Now, another thing that I always cover in interview prep with my candidates is the idea of just getting to the next stage. Like every time you go into an interview, if it's a screening interview, you need to concentrate on getting to the next stage. You're not going to get the next stage if you ask about compensation or benefits or, what the firm can do for you. You're only going to get to the next stage if you just don't make these mistakes. Like all these mistakes that I'm talking about, if any one of them, if you make them, you're going to have issues. I had an interesting thing happen. I was at the University of Chicago, and I had this professor that kept giving me like B pluses on these papers. And I went and I was like, what am I doing wrong? What am I going to do? And he said something that I never forgot. He said, well, when people get, good grades, I don't have to put any remarks on them. Like there's something wrong with this logic or this is a mistake. Like they just come back and they're just great job, and they give them an A. So your job in an interview is not to make any of the mistakes that I've talked about. You have to, every one of these things I've talked about, you have to make sure that you don't make these mistakes. And so, you need to, really concentrate, not making mistakes in terms of the things that you're saying. The other big thing that a lot of people that don't get jobs do is they go into the interview and they will not have enthusiasm, or sometimes you can go in the interview and be very enthusiastic, and then, some partner will just rub you the wrong way and say mean things, and the rest of the interviews you're just kind of shocked. So, you need to realize, that you need to come across as enthusiastic. You need to read people, if you get a bad interview, you need to read people very well. You need to understand the things that I've talked about today. And you need to be up. I mean, everything's about, having like almost the best attorneys have, what I would call like a magnetic personality. They really come across as enthusiastic about their subject matter and enthusiastic about the firm, and good attorneys and the kind of attorneys that clients would hire. And you need to be really understand sales. One of the things that's very sad about attorneys is attorneys are often taught that sales is bad. It used to be in the legal profession that lawyers wouldn't even go out looking for work. They would just sit there and expect, because of their great qualifications, that people would come to us. And advertising by attorneys actually used to be illegal. Like attorneys weren't allowed to advertise. And I mean, that's why, today you see posters and things about personal injury attorneys and different types of attorneys, but it used to be, that they couldn't sell. But now, you need to be able to sell yourself. You need to come across with reasons that you would probably be, the best, attorney for them. If you don't sell yourself, then people aren't going to be impressed. And this is what the best attorneys do. Like they go into an interview and they get the job because they sell themselves. They sell themselves based on their personality. They sell themselves based on how much they know about the firm. They sell themselves about their enthusiasm. They just, they just, want you to sell. And, there's a lot of sales books out there, and I don't know, there's some that are probably, very well known. I don't really read sales books anymore. I did years ago, but understanding sales is important. Like, how does the salesman do? How does the salesman get agreement? How does the salesman get people to like them? How does it, all these different things that are important, when you sell things. I used to have this business when I was younger. It was basically an asphalt ceiling business. And I went door to door around different cities, Grosse Pointe, Michigan in particular. And I would, my competition was this guy that was, all beat up and wore overalls and had been doing it for like 50 years and, kept liquor on his truck and, it was very expensive. And so I came along and I was young and I would literally show up coat and tie in the middle of summer, not a tie and a shirt, in the middle of summer and all dressed up and started selling the service. And when this guy just basically would quote a price, he wouldn't say anything great about his service, but I would have all these great things about my service. And what was so amazing is because of that, I mean, I got almost every single client. I mean, I had other things that I did, saying that I was on the industry once per year and that kind of thing, but it worked. And I established a very successful business, and it was all about learning how to sell myself and how to look very strong. And, when you don't get interviewed, when you're not converting interviews into jobs, I hate to say, you shouldn't do this, but a lot of people, when they're having problems with interviews, and I hope this helps you, will come across as kind of losers. I mean, they won't look strong to the firm. They'll be like beaten down and not have the same enthusiasm they might have had, when they were younger. And so you need to figure out, kind of the kind of, attorney that you want to be. I mean, and if you look like a loser, they're not going to hire you. What is a loser? A loser is someone that doesn't have enthusiasm for the firm. A loser is someone that doesn't have enthusiasm for themselves, all those sorts of things. You need to figure out how to get self-esteem and be very, very good at your interviews. I mean, and come across as a winner, because people hire winners and losers. Lawyers, they're supposed to win. I mean, they're supposed to get the best results for their clients. They're supposed to, work really, really hard. They're supposed to have the ability to motivate groups of people to work hard. I mean, they're can get results. And so you need to come across as a winner that does, lots of different, it's able to, get a job. And they don't want to hire people that act like they don't want to work hard. It's just, or are kind of beaten down. It just doesn't work. And by the way, what happens a lot of times to senior attorneys, so say a senior attorney has worked in law firms for 10 years, and doesn't have any business and is having a hard time finding a job. I mean, many times that person, unless they have a ton of enthusiasm and they come across as very, very well versed in the practice area, that person won't get hired because they didn't get a partner, they don't have any business, and then when they they're kind of beaten down and they've lost, and law firms don't like to hire them. And I'm not saying that happens to every candidate, because I get senior candidates jobs all the time, but it happens a lot. And so, there's different types of candidates and, different law firms, and you could probably be one of them. There's kind of a cruiser candidate. A lot of candidates and law firms are kind of cruisers. Like, they don't have a fierce drive to be partner. They'll do the work competently, but they just don't have a lot of enthusiasm for them. They may have gone to really good schools and, have good skills and so forth, and they'll do good work, but, sometimes they make partner. But these kind of people that just kind of fall in the middle, get hired, don't get hired quite often. And cruisers are someone that is just in all law firms. Then you have grinders, and grinders are people that could be complete nerds, and they'll put their heads down and they'll work as hard as they possibly can. And they definitely want to become partners. They'll do whatever they can. They will work the most hours. They will, often not attract clients because all they're doing is working. And, losers, obviously don't get hired, but grinders often do. And then there's also minders, which are like kind of the administrative staff inside of a law firm, people who are in committees and so forth. So, these are kind of the 5 questions. I cover these quite a bit, but this is what the employers want to know. They want to know if you can do the job. I mean, do you have the work habits? Can you do the practice area? They want to know if you really want the job, which is very important to them, which you need to do whatever you can to come across. They want to know if you'll fit in, which again is very important. If you can, fit in well. They want to know if they can manage you. I don't know if you'll stick around. So this is kind of, for a lot of attorneys, is the big one. Law firms want you to stick around, because if you don't stick around, then they're going to have to replace you. It's a lot of work and money to replace an attorney, and it's also bad for clients. It's bad for the morale of the firm, for the associates there. When people leave, it makes it look like there's better stuff elsewhere. So, law firms really want to know, if you're going to be able to stick around there for a long time. So the answer I give to that, I'm sorry to be, so much detail there, but it's very, very important. The law firms want to believe that this firm matches everything you've been seeking, and you will definitely stick around. And I've talked about this a lot, but this is often, the most important thing. And then how much you want the job is very important. You need to communicate that as well. And this, what I've talked about today, is really, some of the most important, things that, are, you can, think about. Another example here are badgers. They work alone, they're fearless, they protect themselves, are unafraid of other people, they'll hunt and open and fight people, and they're very intelligent. And, so this goes to kind of your work ethic. Like if you're come across as very, very, committed to what you're doing and doing a good job, that will help you. And, that's, a lot of stuff here are interviews just about the job. And I would recommend reading all this. There's also, different, things that are, that I don't want to go into all this detail today. Let me just see here about the job. These are very important. This is an article here, but there's also, there's some more information, information that I would recommend, reading, as well. So there's also the second round interviews. I'm not going to go too much into that. Let me just see a lot of stuff here. You can see I'm very passionate about this. To read all this, go through here. Red flags, answers. These are some answers that people give about why they're leaving. It's getting boring. That's a bad one. I want to make more money is a bad one. The fact that you were hired to do a certain type of work, but then you're doing another work is a bad one because it makes it look like you're inflexible. That's a bad one. Different things, talking about the morale is low is not a good one. Work is often a good one, but you have to make sure that there really isn't work at the firm before you say that. So I'm not going to review each of these. I just go through here. We're almost done with this. I just want to make sure there's a few more questions. And this is really a very comprehensive guide. So the final thing I'd like to say is that when you go into interviews, and I said this at the beginning, that the employer that gets your resume, brings you in, wants to hire you. They absolutely want to hire you. They don't want you to screw up. They want you to do well. And it's really, every job is yours to lose. And most people lose the jobs by not answering the questions and also not giving the employer kind of the information that they want to hear when they're, when they're interviewing for the job. You have to, I hope you took good notes on this, when I talked, but it's really, more about, not screwing up these things, realizing that the attorney, wants to hire you. The reason they want to hire you is because they don't want to have to interview a lot of people. Typically, they have, a lot of work that's not getting done, so they're losing money. So you need to go into the interview and answer these questions correctly. And I think that's about it. I know this has been kind of a long webinar, but there's a cheat sheet at the end of this book, which I would, try to review all these things in print and, just, more about that. So that's the book, the most important questions. One other thing, just some people ask, and I'm trying to be comprehensive here because I'm really trying to help you. Some people ask questions like, what questions should I ask at the end of the interview? And people will ask some of the dumbest questions, and I want to get into them. But the most important question you can ask, and we'll get people talking, is like, what would success look like, in the next 30, 60, 90 days in this position? Like, what would it look like for you? This question for partners. And you ask, asking about, that really shows that you're trying to succeed. Then you could ask the partner, what would I do to be, like a really outstanding associate here, one of your best associates? You can ask questions like that. So ask anything that shows that you want to perform, but don't ask questions about anything to do with compensation, anything to do with, other things kind of unrelated to performing. Okay, so that's a presentation. I'll take a quick break. We'll come back in just a few minutes, and then I will answer the questions that everyone has. This webinar has been a little bit long today, so I'm going to try to take the best questions. And if there are other questions that come up, that you write in the chat that I don't have time to answer, I'll work on those next week. Next week actually might be a good time, since we've done all this interview stuff, to do like a resume review. So I'm going to see about us doing that next week. So thank you, and I will be back in just a few minutes to wrap this up. Okay, so we're going to get started with questions. Just give me 1 second. I'm going to pull up a Word document. Second, so share. Okay, so here we go. Let me just change the view of this question. Okay, so we actually edited a lot of these questions, so which is good. So I'm going to pull them up individually. Or give me 1 second, I'm sharing. I just have to make sure I edit the question up on my camera. So I'm just working on these questions. Okay, so first question is, so the first question is, in an experience, interviewers frequently ask why I left my previous firm or why I'm considering a new opportunity. What is the best way to address these questions without coming across as overly negative or focused on compensation? So if you left your previous firm and you're currently unemployed, the best way really to answer that question is to say something along the lines of the firm didn't have enough work. And that's often the case. Maybe you weren't getting enough work, but saying the firm didn't have enough work is often a very good reason. It's much more difficult when you've left a firm to get a position than if you're currently employed. And again, the reason is because lawyers expect other lawyers to constantly be employed. If you're unemployed, then it sends a message. I mean, you got fired, maybe there are personality problems, maybe you did something wrong, and they just don't know. So oftentimes when that happens, you end up moving to less prestigious firms, unless you have a very well-defined practice area and you're just very, very focused on doing one thing. So, that's kind of how I would recommend it. You have to have good reasons that are positive. Typically, not enough work is a good one. Sometimes, women will leave to have kids. That's actually respected, but you really need to come across as positive, not enough work, or something related to reasons for you leaving that had nothing to do with you, the problems of the firm. But those problems definitely have to be focused on work. You shouldn't be leaving jobs because of the compensation. Attorneys always should be doing their best to stay employed wherever you are. But if you are unemployed, it's all kind of, the market is all about supply and demand. So if there's not enough people like you, then law firms will hire you. So what does that mean? That means if you have a very well-defined practice area, you can often be able to get into better firms based on other firms, because there's not a lot of people like you. But where there's really not a lot of people like you, typically is in smaller markets where there's just not a lot of people competing for the jobs. So I have firms in all these areas all over the country all the time that are looking for people. And they're unable to find people because there's just not enough attorneys in the market. So applying to those firms is often, a very good strategy. Okay, I've been practicing law for several years, but I'm now seeking to move into a different practice area. How should I approach interviews when my experiences are perfectly aligned with this job description? What strategies can I use to demonstrate my potential to succeed in a new field? Okay, so it's very difficult to switch practice areas. So the reason being is if a law firm has an opening for someone in a practice area, why would they hire someone that's trying to switch practice areas as opposed to someone that's already in that practice area? I had an interesting thing happen. I had a guy that was litigation attorney, like a major firm in San Diego, like a really prestigious firm. And he was also first in his law school class from Brigham Young, and it was interesting. It was trying to switch practice areas to get a job in corporate. And we sent him to firms, all over, the country, just not a single bite. Because, why would someone train a new attorney in a practice area? He actually did get one bite to get some questions from a firm in Texas, but nothing ever materialized from it. So, if you're seeking to move into a different practice area, typically the way it's done is you try to apply to firms where there's not a lot of people like you. So if you have really good qualifications, for example, you can move to a firm that may have a need for someone like you in a different location of the country. So that basically means that, if I knew a girl, for example, who was a law attorney in Palo Alto, and she wanted to do environmental law and just was having zero luck in Palo Alto, and then applied to some firms in like smaller cities in California, and ended up getting a job at a really good firm in Sacramento doing environmental law. So Sacramento is a much smaller market, but she was able to do that by going to market different. So just remember that everything is about the law of supply and demand, and being able to put yourself in a position where there's not a lot of people like you is going to make a practice area switch easier. The other thing I would say to you too, if you're interested in switching practice areas, is that's kind of a very difficult topic, because sometimes you may be switching practice areas, like there's like 30 different types of litigation. You may be interested in doing one type of litigation, and it's very, very difficult to switch to another type of litigation when you're currently doing a certain type of litigation. So it's easier to do that. It's easier to switch within like litigation to another litigation job than it is to switch from like litigation to corporate. So just a couple things to keep in mind when you're deciding to switch practice areas is there are kind of two different types of attorneys. There's attorneys that do transactional work, which are things like corporate and real estate and, meaning they work with documents and they perfect documents and that sort of thing. And then there's attorneys that do things like litigation, which tends to be, making arguments, attacking the other side, trying to get information out of them, using that information against them. And so, one of those may appeal to you or the other. So transactional law tends to appeal to people that are doing things like, sorry, I'm just blanking, are good at math and science and those types of things. They typically prefer transactional work. So if you're that type of person and you're doing, litigation, you may not like it. It may just completely not appeal to you. And so, you often, if you're switching practice areas, can ask to do so in your own firm. With a guy I was telling you about, there was first in his class in Brigham Young, he was actually able to do it in his own firm. But, typically the switch between transactional and litigation related work is really what it's all about. And that's really the hardest because, you have to really demonstrate that you have a profound interest in these different type of practice areas. And the training is so much different. Thought processes are so much different in transactional versus litigation. So one or the other, you actually, if you're someone that enjoys writing, you enjoy arguing, you enjoy philosophy and psychology, you're typically going to be much better at litigation than someone that gravitates towards like economics and math and science and that sort of thing. I've noticed that some interviewers focus heavily on my long-term career goals, but as a mid-level attorney, I'm still exploring different paths in the legal field. How can I answer these questions in a way that shows ambition and commitment without being too specific or pigeonholing myself? Okay, so you have to, as a mid-level attorney, if they're focusing on your long-term goals, the only answer that's proper is to say that I want to go there and work really hard to be partner. You can't really show any hesitation about that particular fact. You just need to make that kind of crystal clear to people. You can't really worry. You shouldn't be, if you're exploring different career paths like going in-house or whatever, you don't want to talk about that. Once you go in-house, by the way, it's very, very difficult to get back into law firms. So you really want to focus on, your, showing that you want to do the best you possibly can and make partner. That's what they're looking for. Mid-level attorneys, by the way, law firms love. They love them because they're the most marketable. They love them because they've already been trained in their practice area. They know what they're doing. The billing rates aren't that high, and partners can give them work hard, and they're also going to work extra hard because they're going to become a partner. So mid-level attorneys are, one type of attorney that, typically is very marketable, but you can't express any doubts about them. Now, if you have those doubts, it's fine, but keep them to yourself. If you want to get a job in a law firm, you're going to need to express that level of enthusiasm because that's the only way they're going to hire you. Okay, when asked about my weakness or areas of improvement, I struggle to identify something that doesn't work for them my ability to do the job. What are some approaches to answering this question honestly while still demonstrating self-awareness and commitment to growth? So all these questions that you answer regarding this, you say things like, I'm very competitive in nature. Sometimes I'm too competitive. You say that I often work too hard. I love my job too much. Sometimes I take more assignments than I should. Anything that shows like a lot of dedication to your practice area and to, working hard are your weaknesses. Your weaknesses aren't, things like bad personal relationships or alcohol problems. You just have to focus on the things that are really showing, that you're focused on, the high performance is sort of the drawbacks of that. Okay. In panel interviews, I sometimes find it difficult to connect with multiple interviewers who may have different expectations or areas of focus. What are some techniques to ensure that I engage with each panelist effectively and address their concerns, even if the questions vary widely? Okay, so, when you go into an interview, like I said earlier, typically 30% of the people will like you right away, it's 33%. The other 3% won't care, and the perception of the people won't like you. There's no reason to understand why they won't like you. It's just how things work. So, when you go into those situations, what you try to do is sometimes there'll be hostile interviewers. You try to be, very direct and nice and answer the questions. Other times, you may be dealing with, people that aren't really interested in you one way or another, but you try to connect with them. So most panel interviews will be pretty nice, but my best approach, I think, with panel interviewers is you try to talk to them all. If you're answering one person's question that might be related to another person's question, then you try to, make eye contact with them and show them that you heard their last question. And then again, with panel interviewers, you can't control the people that don't like you necessarily, but you can come across as very, competent and someone that do a good job. Given the competitive nature of the legal job market, how can I differentiate myself from other candidates? Interview, particularly many of them have similar education, work experience, or specific strategies that work very well. Yes, and I talked about the sort of the focus on your practice area. Your focus on your practice area is really one of the most important. So your resume needs to look like you're very focused. You need to come across that you're very focused, and that really is the most important thing, and that you really want to work there. So, so people will interview with firms all the time, and I'm just going to sit there and answer questions, but there won't really be a lot of enthusiasm about it. And they need to talk about how the firm matches their interest and things that they would like to do. I've been told that asking insightful questions at the end of the interview can leave a strong impression. Could you provide examples of questions that also demonstrate a deep understanding of the firm's culture, expectations, or recent cases, while helping me assess if the firm's the right fit for my career goals? Okay, so when you go in an interview, your job is not to interview them about what it's like to work there. Your job is to get the job and convince the firm that you really want to work there. So, you don't want to, your job is never to assess if the firm is the right fit for your career goals. The time to do that is after you get an offer. So every stage of the interview, you want to avoid anything that is going to show any lack of commitment to what they're offering, or anything that they need to sell you on, because there are going to be people that interview with them that are needing to be sold, that won't have doubts. So, again, the questions you ask at the interview should always be, what does success look like 30, 60, 90 days? That's a big one. What would it look like? What would, your most successful associate or you do, or what, how can I serve you? What we can be able to do to serve you better, and that sort of thing. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't have much time for more questions. This interview went a little over, and I got to go somewhere. But if you have more questions, there are already in the chat. I will try to answer those in the next webinar. I certainly appreciate everyone being here today. I know it was a little bit of a long webinar, but I think that we definitely covered a lot of very important. Thanks again.